Welcome to History's Mysteries, a place where the echoes of the past linger in the quiet of night. Here, forgotten worlds awaken softly, and the stories of time unfold like dreams. So settle in, breathe deeply, and let history whisper you to sleep.
The Curse of the Amber Room. You've probably heard whispers about cursed treasures, the Hope Diamond, King Tut's tomb, maybe even that supposedly haunted doll your aunt keeps in her attic. But tonight, as you settle in, let me tell you about something that makes those tales seem almost quaint. The Amber Room, sometimes called the eighth wonder of the world, and the shadow of misfortune that has followed everyone who's ever gotten too close to it. Picture this. It's 1701 in Prussia, and Friedrich I has just crowned himself king. He wants something spectacular, something that will make every other European monarch green with envy. So he commissions the finest craftsmen to create a room entirely panelled in amber. Not just any amber, mind you, but 6 tons of the finest Baltic amber, backed with gold leaf and mirrors, embedded with precious stones. The amber itself ranged in colour from pale yellow to deep orange red, and when candles lit the room, it would glow like the inside of a sunset. Imagine standing in a chamber where every surface shimmers with warm, honey-coloured light, where the walls seem alive with ancient resin that once oozed from prehistoric trees. It took a decade to complete, and when it was finished, it was worth about $500 million in today's money. But here's where our story really begins. In 1716, Friedrich Wilhelm I, who inherited the throne and preferred military uniforms to fancy rooms, decided to give the Amber Room to Peter the Great of Russia as a gift to cement an alliance against Sweden. The panels were carefully dismantled, packed into 18 large boxes, and shipped to St. Petersburg. Peter was delighted, though he died before he could properly install it. His daughter, Elizabeth, eventually had it moved to the Catherine Palace in Tsarskoye Selo, just outside St. Petersburg, where it was expanded to fill a larger space. For more than 2 centuries, the Amber Room remained there, dazzling visitors, surviving revolutions and regime changes, a glowing testament to Baroque excess and artistic achievement. Then came June 1941. Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, and within months, German forces were pushing toward Leningrad. The Soviets knew the Catherine Palace was in danger. They tried desperately to save the Amber Room, attempting to dismantle it and pack it away, but the amber had become brittle with age. It started crumbling at the slightest touch. So instead, they tried to hide it, covering the panels with wallpaper, hoping the Germans wouldn't notice. It was a futile gesture. When the Germans arrived in September 1941, they knew exactly what they were looking for. A German art historian named Alfred Rode, who specialized in amber, was brought in. He'd been obsessed with the Amber Room for years. Within 36 hours, the Nazis had carefully dismantled what Soviet curators couldn't touch, packed it into 27 crates, and shipped it to Königsberg Castle in East Prussia, in what's now Kaliningrad, Russia. Hitler considered the Amber Room German property anyway. It had been created in Prussia, after all, and planned to display it in a massive museum complex he dreamed of building after the war. For a while, the Amber Room was actually displayed in Königsberg Castle, reassembled in a dedicated hall. Visitors came to see it, marveling at this stolen wonder. But By 1943, as the war turned against Germany and Allied bombs began falling on German cities, the castle's director ordered the room dismantled and crated up again. And this is where the trail goes cold, where history dissolves into rumor and speculation, and where the curse really seems to take hold. Alfred Rode, the amber expert who helped steal the room, died in December 1945 in a Soviet hospital. His wife died the same day. The official cause was typhus, but some wondered if it was really disease that killed them, or something else. Interrogation, perhaps, or something more mysterious. You see, Rode claimed to have hidden the amber room, but he never revealed where, if he even knew. Some say Soviet authorities questioned him too roughly, desperate for information. Others whisper that he took the secret to his grave deliberately, that the room itself had gotten into his mind somehow, made him possessive, unwilling to share. The director of Königsberg Castle, who ordered the room packed away, disappeared during the Soviet assault on the city in 1945. Never seen again. Königsberg itself was bombed heavily, the castle damaged and later demolished by the Soviets in 1968. If the amber room was still there, buried in the rubble, it's now under a pile of concrete and Soviet-era buildings. But that's just the beginning of the disappearances and deaths. In 1945, a German soldier named Georg Stein claimed he helped pack the amber room into crates and knew where it was hidden. Before he could provide details, he was killed. Some say by the Soviets, others say by fellow Germans who didn't want the secret revealed. In 1959, a man in East Germany came forward, saying his father had been part of the transport team that moved the crates. He died in a car crash before he could be properly interviewed. In 1979, a German investigative journalist named Paul Encke spent years researching the Amber Room's fate. He became convinced it was hidden in a network of tunnels under Königsberg. He died suddenly of a heart attack at age 45, his research notes scattered and incomplete. In 1987, another German researcher, Georg Klemm, claimed to have new evidence about the room's location. He died in mysterious circumstances shortly after, his apartment ransacked, his files gone. The pattern continued. In 1991, during the chaos following the Soviet Union's collapse, a former Soviet intelligence officer named Yuri Gusev announced he knew where the Amber Room was hidden. He had documents, he said, maps. He was found dead in a forest outside Moscow. Shot once in the head, his briefcase missing. Ruled a robbery, though his expensive watch and wallet were still on his body. In 1997, German art dealer Alexander Braun tried to sell an amber mosaic that had definitely been part of the Amber Room. One of the Florentine mosaics. A small panel depicting touch and smell from a series representing the 5 senses. When police raided his home, they found the panel, proving that at least some pieces of the room had survived. But Braun claimed his father, a German lieutenant, had taken it as a souvenir during the war. Before investigators could question him thoroughly about whether his father had known the location of the rest, Braun died of cancer. The mosaic panel is now in a museum, but it only deepened the mystery. If one piece survived, where were the tons of others? Between 1979 and 2003, at least 17 people who claimed knowledge of the Amber Room's location, or who were actively searching for it, died in unusual circumstances. Heart attacks despite no history of heart disease, car accidents, mysterious falls, one drowning in calm waters. Statisticians might say this is coincidence, that people die all the time, especially people obsessed with dangerous treasure hunts, trudging through collapsed buildings and unstable tunnels. But those close to the searches began to whisper about a curse, about amber's ancient power turned dark. You see, amber isn't just fossilized resin, it's organic, once alive in a way, preserving insects and plant matter from millions of years ago. Baltic cultures have always considered amber magical, protective. They made amber amulets to ward off evil, amber rosaries for prayer, but like any powerful object, amber can be corrupted, or so the stories go. 6 tons of it, shaped into beauty and then stolen, fought over, hidden away. Perhaps it absorbed all that greed and violence, transformed from protection to punishment. The theories about the room's location are numerous and contradictory. Some believe it's still buried in Königsberg's ruins, perhaps in the castle's cellars, perhaps in nearby bunkers. Others think it was loaded onto a ship, maybe the Wilhelm Gustloff, which sank in 1945 with massive loss of life, or another vessel that went down in the Baltic Sea. There are theories about salt mines in central Germany, about Austrian mountain hideaways, about railway tunnels sealed by explosives. A few researchers think the amber room was destroyed in the 1945 bombing of Königsberg, burned up in the fires that ravaged the city. Amber burns, after all, releasing a sweet smell as it melts. Perhaps the 8th wonder of the world simply went up in smoke, and all the deaths since have been over nothing but ashes and memory. In 1979, the Soviet government, tired of the mystery and wanting their treasure back, commissioned a team to recreate the amber room from photographs and drawings. It took 24 years and cost $11 million. In 2003, the new amber room was unveiled in the Catherine Palace, restored to its original location. It's beautiful, absolutely stunning, and tourists come from around the world to see it. But it's not the same. The original panels had developed a patina over 3 centuries, a depth of colour and character that can't be replicated. And of course, the new room carries none of the history, none of the blood and obsession of the original. But the searches haven't stopped. Even with a replica in place, treasure hunters, historians, and amateur sleuths continue looking for the original. In 2008, a team of German researchers using ground-penetrating radar claimed to have found a hidden chamber beneath Deutschnudorf, a small town on the Czech-German border. They insisted it contained treasures from Königsberg Castle, possibly including the amber room. They began excavation. Nothing was found, and funding dried up. The team leader later admitted to depression and obsession, how the search had consumed his marriage, his finances, his peace of mind. In 2016, 2 men in Poland claimed they'd found a Nazi gold train in a mountain tunnel, a train that supposedly carried not just gold, but art treasures from the war. The amber room, they hinted, might be aboard. Using ground-penetrating radar, they showed what looked like a tunnel and something inside it. The Polish government took the claims seriously enough to investigate. Excavations found, nothing. Empty tunnels, disturbed earth, but no train, no gold, no amber. The 2 men stuck to their story, claiming they'd been misled by their equipment, or perhaps that someone else had gotten there first. Both experienced financial ruin from the failed expedition. One divorced, the other was sued by investors. They spoke in interviews about sleepless nights, about dreams of glowing amber panels just out of reach, about a compulsion they couldn't explain or shake. This is what the amber room seems to do to people. It gets inside their heads. Rational individuals become obsessed, lose perspective, stake everything on finding it. There's a psychological term for this kind of fixation, but it doesn't quite capture what happens to amber room seekers. They don't just want to find it. They need to, as if the room itself is calling to them across time and space, promising glory, wealth, vindication. And then something goes wrong. Always something goes wrong. Consider the Russian archaeologist Andrei Vorobyev, who in 2010 announced he'd pinpointed the room's location using newly declassified Soviet military documents. He claimed it was in a flooded mine shaft in Saxony, Germany. He assembled a team, secured permits, began pumping out water. 3 weeks into the project, there was an accident. A support beam collapsed. Vorobyev survived, but was paralyzed from the waist down. The mine flooded again before any search could be completed. From his wheelchair, Vorobyev later said he regretted ever hearing about the amber room, that he wished he'd listened to his wife, who'd had nightmares about amber burning while he drowned. Or think about the British historian Trevor Stevens, who in 2013 wrote a book claiming the amber room was destroyed in 1945, that everyone searching for it was chasing a ghost. He argued persuasively, using documentary evidence, eyewitness accounts, and scientific analysis of amber's fragility. His book sold well. He seemed to have put the mystery to rest. Then, 6 months after publication, he recanted everything in a rambling blog post, saying he'd been wrong, that the room survived and he now knew where it was. His publisher was baffled. His colleagues worried about his mental state. He disappeared into the forests of Kaliningrad Oblast, searching. Russian authorities found him 3 weeks later, dehydrated and delirious, digging with his bare hands in frozen ground. He had no memory of those weeks, couldn't explain what had driven him there. The stories pile up like this, dozens of them, maybe hundreds if you count everyone who spent significant time hunting the amber room or claiming knowledge of it. Not all of them die or suffer catastrophe, but the percentage is high enough to make you wonder. Statistical anomaly? Mass hysteria? Or is there something about this particular treasure that invites disaster? Amber itself has properties that science doesn't fully understand. It generates static electricity when rubbed, which ancient peoples noticed and attributed to magical qualities. It can preserve DNA across millions of years. Scientists have extracted viable genetic material from insects trapped in amber, a fact that inspired Jurassic Park. Some researchers believe amber emits low levels of electromagnetic radiation. Could 6 tons of it, packed together for decades, then scattered and hidden, create some kind of field that affects those who get close? It sounds absurd, like pseudoscience, but people who've spent time near large collections of amber sometimes report headaches, vivid dreams, a buzzing sensation. More likely, the curse is purely human. Greed, obsession, the toxic combination of hope and desperation that makes people take foolish risks. The amber room represents the ultimate treasure hunt, valuable beyond measure, lost under dramatic circumstances, tantalizing clues scattered everywhere and nowhere. It's the perfect hook for the human imagination. And once hooked, people destroy themselves, neglecting families and careers, spending money they don't have, venturing into dangerous places, trusting the wrong people. The curse isn't supernatural, it's psychological. The amber doesn't need to be haunted to ruin lives. The mere idea of it is enough. But then there are the coincidences that are hard to explain away. The number of researchers who've died right before planned announcements about the room's location. The way critical evidence keeps disappearing. Documents burned in house fires, computers stolen, witnesses dying before they can testify. It's possible this is just bad luck compounded over decades, but it's also possible that someone or multiple someones are actively working to keep the Amber Room hidden. Perhaps they know where it is and are protecting it. Perhaps they're guarding it for the right moment to reveal it. Or perhaps they know it was destroyed and are maintaining the mystery for their own purposes. To sell fake maps, to keep grant money flowing, to preserve the legend that brings tourism and book sales and documentary deals. There's a darker theory, one that sounds like conspiracy but has some circumstantial support, that the KGB and later the FSB have known the room's location since the 1940s and have deliberately eliminated anyone who got too close to finding it. Why? Perhaps because the Amber Room's actual location would reveal something embarrassing, that Soviet forces destroyed it themselves during the assault on Königsberg, or that Soviet officers looted and sold it piece by piece on the black market. Or perhaps Russian intelligence simply enjoys having this mystery, this cultural wound that keeps Germany and Russia connected through shared loss, a bargaining chip that might prove useful someday. The evidence for this theory is thin, mostly the suspicious deaths of Soviet citizens who claimed knowledge and the way Russian authorities sometimes seem to know more than they're saying. But in Russia's murky world of state secrets and intelligence operations, it's not entirely implausible. Or maybe the answer is simpler and sadder. The Amber Room is gone. Fire consumed it, or it shattered when bombs hit, or it was broken up and sold off in pieces too small to identify. The one surviving panel, that Florentine mosaic, might be all that remains. Everything else, ash, fragments, dust. The deaths and disasters associated with finding it are just the normal toll of dangerous obsession, no different from the casualties of any gold rush or treasure fever. The curse is what we call it, when people refuse to accept loss, when they can't let go of beauty that's passed beyond recovery. But you're lying here in the dark, and I'm telling you this story, and maybe you're wondering, what if it's real? What if those amber panels are still out there, packed in crates in some forgotten chamber, waiting? What if the room itself, created to dazzle and impress, has developed a kind of consciousness, a hunger to be found that reaches out and touches susceptible minds? It sounds ridiculous in daylight, but here in the quiet hours, with sleep pressing close, maybe it doesn't seem so impossible. After all, we barely understand consciousness in humans. Who's to say that 6 tons of organic amber arranged in deliberate patterns, infused with centuries of awe and violence, couldn't develop some kind of awareness? The last credible search happened in 2020, right before the pandemic shut everything down. A team of Polish and German researchers, using advanced AI to analyze wartime documents and photographs, claimed they'd identified a pattern in Nazi shipping records that pointed to a specific location, a sealed tunnel system near the town of Wałbrzych in Poland. They announced they'd begin excavation in spring 2020. Then COVID-19 hit. The project was postponed, then the funding fell through. Then the team's lead researcher, a German professor named Klaus Zimmermann, died of COVID-19 complications at age 52. The project hasn't resumed. Zimmermann's AI algorithm was on his personal computer, which his family couldn't unlock. His research notes were in a storage unit that flooded during a storm, destroying everything. Another dead end, another life consumed by amber. So where is the Amber Room now? The truth is, no one knows. It might be in Kaliningrad's ruins, buried under concrete and time. It might be at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. inside a rusted ship that will never be found. It might be an assault mine, a bunker, a collapsed tunnel, a forgotten warehouse. Or it might exist only in photographs and memories now, its physical form scattered beyond recovery, but its legend growing stronger every year. What we do know is this: people will keep looking. The mystery is too alluring, the prize too magnificent, the possibility too tantalizing. Someone else will come forward with new evidence, new technology, new theories. They'll assemble a team, secure funding, begin excavation, and maybe, just maybe, they'll be the lucky ones who finally find it. Or maybe they'll join the long list of those who got too close to the amber and paid the price. There's a Russian curator at the Catherine Palace, an elderly woman who is part of the team that built the replica Amber Room. She gives tours sometimes, telling visitors about the original, its creation, its theft, its loss. She always ends with the same statement, spoken softly. The Amber Room doesn't want to be found. It had its time, its glory, and now it rests. We should let it sleep. When asked if she believes the curse is real, she smiles sadly and says, "I believe obsession is real, and that's curse enough." Maybe she's right. Maybe the real curse isn't supernatural at all. It's simply human nature, our inability to accept that some beautiful things are gone forever, our compulsion to chase what we've lost, even when the chase destroys us. The Amber Room was created to showcase wealth and power, to make people gasp and wonder. It succeeded brilliantly, and when it vanished, it became something even more powerful, an eternal mystery, a golden thread running through history, connecting everyone who's ever dreamed of finding it. Perhaps that's the room's final triumph, its ultimate purpose, not to be seen and admired in a static location, but to move through time as an idea, inspiring and destroying in equal measure, forever just out of reach, forever glowing in our imaginations like candlelight through honey-coloured resin. The panels might be gone, but the Amber Room itself lives on, more present in its absence than it ever was in its reality. And as long as people keep searching, keep dying, keep dreaming of that impossible golden glow, the room continues to exist, not in any physical space, but in the dangerous territory between hope and obsession, where all curses are born and fed. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, think of those amber panels, wherever they are. Think of them glowing softly in the dark, waiting, patient as stone, hungry as legend, and be glad you're only hearing about them, not searching for them. Some treasures are better left lost. Some mysteries are safer unsolved. The Amber Room has claimed enough lives already. Let it keep its secrets. Let it rest in whatever darkness holds it now, and let us rest too, here in the safety of distance, content to wonder but wise enough not to seek. That might be the only way to break the curse, to simply stop looking, to let the amber sleep undisturbed, glowing only in stories told on quiet nights like this, beautiful and deadly and forever, just beyond our reach. The Curse of the Hope Diamond. You've probably heard whispers about cursed objects, those relics that seem to carry misfortune in their wake, like a shadow that never quite lifts. The Hope Diamond sits in the Smithsonian now, behind thick glass, spinning slowly under carefully calibrated lights that make its deep blue facets gleam with an almost supernatural intensity. Tourists press close, phones raised, trying to capture that famous colour, that legendary stone. What they're really trying to photograph is danger made beautiful, tragedy crystallized into 45.52 carats of mineralogical perfection. The curse, if you believe in such things, has supposedly been dormant since the diamond found its final home in that museum case. But the stories that led it there, those tales of ruin and death and inexplicable misfortune, those stories never quite lose their power to unsettle. The diamond's journey began not in some European court, but in India, sometime in the 17th century, when a stone of remarkable size and even more remarkable colour was pried from the earth. The exact location has been lost to time, though most scholars point to the Kolar mine in Golconda, a place that produced some of history's most famous diamonds. This stone, in its original form, weighed over 100 carats, a blue so deep and saturated that it seemed to hold night itself within its atomic structure. The colour comes from trace amounts of boron atoms scattered through the crystal lattice, a geological accident that created something humans would kill for. According to the most persistent legend, the stone was originally set in a statue of the Hindu goddess Sita, where it served as one of her eyes, watching over her devotees with that penetrating blue gaze. A French merchant and trader named Jean-Baptiste Tavernier supposedly stole the diamond from the statue during his extensive travels through India. The moment he pried that stone from the goddess's face, the story goes, he sealed not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone who would subsequently possess the gem. The priests, discovering the theft, pronounced a curse upon the diamond and anyone who would dare claim it as their own. Tavernier, so the legend claims, was eventually torn apart by wild dogs in Russia, though historical records tell a less dramatic story of a merchant who died peacefully of natural causes. But let's set aside for a moment what actually happened to Tavernier and focus instead on what people believed happened, because the power of a curse lies not in metaphysical reality, but in the human imagination and the meaning we assign to patterns we perceive in chaos. Tavernier, cursed or not, sold the diamond to King Louis XIV of France in 1668. The Sun King, always eager to add to his legendary collection of jewels, purchased the stone along with thousands of other diamonds Tavernier had brought back from India. Louis had the diamond cut by his court jeweller, Sieur Pitot, reducing its weight to 67 carats, but increasing its brilliance. The king wore it on ceremonial occasions, and for a time the diamond brought no obvious misfortune. Louis XIV lived into his 70s, a remarkable age for the era, and died in his bed surrounded by the splendour of Versailles. His great-grandson, Louis XV, inherited the stone and the throne. Louis XV lent the diamond occasionally to his mistress, Madame de Montespan, and later to Madame de Barry. Here, the curse, if we're tracking it, supposedly began to show its teeth. Madame de Montespan fell from royal favour and ended her days in a convent. Madame de Barry's fate was worse. She was arrested during the French Revolution and lost her head to the guillotine in 1793, though thousands of aristocrats met the same end, cursed diamond or not. Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette both wore the diamond on occasion. You know what happened to them? The revolution, the imprisonment, the executions. Their heads fell into baskets while crowds cheered. Was the diamond responsible, or were they simply victims of historical forces far beyond any gemstone's influence? The revolutionary government confiscated the crown jewels, including the blue diamond, and for a time it sat in a treasury, while France tore itself apart. and rebuilt itself over and over again. In September 1792, during a week of chaos and looting, thieves broke into the Garde Meuble, the royal treasury, and stole the French blue along with other crown jewels. The diamond vanished into the underworld of gem dealers and criminals, its trail going cold for decades. Some of the stolen jewels eventually surfaced and were recovered, but the great blue diamond seemed to have disappeared entirely, as if the earth had swallowed it back up, or as if it had never existed at all. What happened during those missing years remains largely mysterious. The diamond had to have been recut to disguise its identity and make it easier to sell. Somewhere, a gem cutter sat down with perhaps the most famous diamond in Europe and deliberately destroyed its original form, grinding away carats of priceless stone to create something new, something that couldn't be immediately recognized. That recutting probably happened in London, which was the center of the diamond trade at the time. The new stone that emerged weighed approximately 45 carats, smaller than the French blue, but still possessing that extraordinary deep blue color that made it unmistakable to anyone who knew what they were looking at. The diamond resurfaced in 1812 in the possession of a London diamond merchant named Daniel Eliasson. Eliasson listed it in his catalogue, describing a deep blue brilliant cut diamond of 44.5 carats. Historical gemologists have compared drawings and descriptions of the French blue with the dimensions and characteristics of what would become the Hope diamond, and the consensus is that they are the same stone, recut to avoid identification. How Eliasson acquired it, who cut it, and what happened in the 20 years between its theft and its appearance in his catalogue remains unknown. Perhaps someday documents will surface that fill in those gaps, or perhaps the secret died with the people who engineered the diamond's transformation. Eliasson sold or passed the diamond to King George IV of England, adding another monarch to the stone's list of owners. George IV was a collector and a spendthrift who accumulated vast debts over his lifetime. When he died in 1830, deeply in debt and not particularly mourned, his possessions were sold to cover what he owed. The diamond was acquired by Henry Philip Hope, a wealthy London banking heir and gem collector, sometime around 1839. Hope's ownership gave the diamond the name it still carries today. He added it to his extensive gem collection, displaying it occasionally, but mostly keeping it secure. When Henry Philip Hope died in 1839, the diamond passed to his nephew Henry Thomas Hope, and then eventually to Henry Thomas's grandson, Lord Francis Hope. Lord Francis Hope had a talent for making poor decisions. He married an American actress named May Yohe, and their marriage quickly turned contentious. Francis's financial situation deteriorated rapidly, his gambling and spending far outpacing his income. Desperately needing money, he sought permission to sell the famous diamond. British law at the time made it difficult for heirs to sell parts of entailed estates, but Francis persisted, and in 1901 he finally received permission to sell the Hope diamond. The sale brought him $154,000, a substantial sum, but far less than the diamond was worth. The money didn't save him. His marriage collapsed. May Yohe left him for another man, and Francis ended his days in reduced circumstances, a formerly wealthy aristocrat brought low by debt and poor judgment. May Yohe, the actress who had briefly been the wife of the Hope diamond's owner, told reporters years later that the diamond was definitely cursed, and that touching it had brought her nothing but misfortune. She claimed that every person associated with the diamond suffered terrible fates. course. By the time she was making these claims, the curse narrative had become part of the diamond's mystique, and claiming to be a victim of the curse was a way of explaining away the ordinary human feelings that had actually destroyed her marriage and her finances. People want their tragedies to mean something, to be part of a larger story, rather than just the predictable consequences of their choices. After leaving Lord Hope's possession, the diamond was purchased by a New York diamond merchant named Simon Frankel, who resold it to a syndicate of buyers. The stone passed through several dealers' hands, each transaction adding to its provenance and perhaps to its legend. In 1909, the diamond was acquired by Pierre Cartier, the famous French jeweler. Cartier recognized that the diamond's growing reputation for being cursed was actually a selling point rather than a liability. A cursed diamond was interesting. A cursed diamond was unique. A cursed diamond was something that wealthy collectors might pay extraordinary sums to own. Danger and beauty combined into a single object. Cartier set his sights on selling the diamond to Evelyn Walsh McLean, an American heiress whose family fortune came from gold mining and newspapers. Evelyn was young, wealthy, bored, and fascinated by the exotic and the dramatic. She was exactly the kind of buyer who might find a cursed diamond irresistible. When Cartier first showed her the diamond, she wasn't particularly impressed. So Cartier did what any good salesman would do. He enhanced the story. He embellished the curse, adding dramatic details and tragic fates. He told Evelyn about everyone who had owned the diamond and suffered, weaving together truth and exaggeration until the diamond's history sounded like something from a Gothic novel. The strategy worked perfectly. Evelyn Walsh McLean became obsessed with owning the Hope diamond. In 1911, Evelyn purchased the diamond for approximately $180,000. She wore it frequently, mounting it on the chain and wearing it around her neck to parties and social events. She even let her children play with it occasionally, the world's most famous diamond becoming a toy in the hands of kids who had no idea what they were holding. Evelyn reportedly believed that curses only worked on people who believed in them, and she claimed not to be superstitious. She wore the diamond as a talisman, something that set her apart from everyone else in her social circle. For a time, her life seemed charmed rather than cursed. She was wealthy, married, and socially prominent. But then the pattern that people would later interpret as the curse began to assert itself in her life. Her eldest son, Vincent, was killed in a car accident at age 9. The loss devastated Evelyn, and she began drinking heavily to cope with her grief. Her marriage to Edward McLean deteriorated as they both struggled with alcoholism and the death of their child. Edward was eventually declared mentally incompetent and spent the last years of his life in a psychiatric institution. Their daughter Evelyn committed suicide at age 25. The family newspaper, the Washington Post, nearly went bankrupt. Evelyn herself struggled with addiction and financial problems for years. Were these tragedies the result of an ancient curse placed on a diamond stolen from a goddess? Or were they the predictable consequences of extreme wealth, lack of purpose, addiction, and the ordinary sorrows that befall families, regardless of what jewelry they own? Evelyn's son died in a car accident, the kind of tragedy that happened to thousands of families as automobiles became common and traffic fatalities soared. Her husband and daughter both struggled with mental health issues, conditions that were poorly understood and poorly treated in that era. The newspaper industry was volatile. and many publications failed during economic downturns. Evelyn's own addiction was enabled by the wealth that allowed her to indulge every impulse without immediate consequences. Yet people preferred the curse explanation because it was more interesting than admitting that wealth couldn't protect you from grief, that privilege didn't make you immune to addiction, that some suffering was simply random and meaningless. The Hope Diamond curse became a way of explaining why the McLean family's wealth hadn't brought them happiness. It became a story about hubris and fate, about forces beyond human control, punishing those who reached too high or took what wasn't theirs. It was a more satisfying narrative than the truth, which was that the McLeans were deeply troubled people who would have been troubled whether they owned a famous diamond or not. When Evelyn Walsh McLean died in 1947, she still owned the Hope Diamond. Her estate was in chaos, debts and taxes eating away at what remained of her fortune. Her jewellery collection, including the diamond, was purchased by Harry Winston, perhaps the most famous diamond dealer of the 20th century. Winston was a different breed of diamond owner entirely. He wasn't an aristocrat or an heiress collecting beautiful objects for display. He was a businessman who understood that diamonds were commodities, investments, items to be bought and sold for profit. The Hope Diamond sat in his inventory for years while he displayed it at various exhibitions and charity events, using it to generate publicity for his business. Winston seemed entirely immune to the curse, if it existed. His business thrived. His personal life was stable. He suffered no unusual tragedies or financial reversals. He treated the Hope Diamond as what it was, a very valuable and very famous piece of carbon arranged in a particular crystalline structure. In 1958, Winston made an extraordinary decision. He donated the Hope Diamond to the Smithsonian Institution, shipping it via registered mail in a plain brown paper package that he insured for $1 million. The most famous diamond in the world arrived at the museum in the same way you might mail a birthday present to a relative. The postal worker who delivered it had no idea what he was carrying. The Smithsonian accepted the diamond and placed it on display in the National Museum of Natural History, where it has remained ever since. Millions of people have viewed it over the decades, pressing close to the case, taking photos, reading the placard that explains its history and mentions the famous curse. The diamond sits there under lights that make it glow. Its deep blue color is extraordinary as ever. All that atomic boron still working its magic on the light that passes through the crystal structure. You can visit it any day the museum is open. You can stand there and look at it as long as you want. The curse, if it ever truly existed, seems to have finally been broken. But has the curse really ended? Or has it simply changed form? The diamond sits in a museum now, owned by no one and everyone, a public trust rather than a private possession. Perhaps curses, like everything else, must evolve with changing times. The Smithsonian has never reported any unusual misfortunes befalling its staff or visitors as a result of displaying the diamond. The museum doesn't suffer mysterious financial troubles or experience supernatural phenomena in the mineral hall. The guards who watch over it don't report feeling oppressed or sensing malevolent presences. The diamond is simply there, beautiful and famous and completely inert, a piece of geological history that happens to have an interesting past. Science tells us exactly what the Hope Diamond is and why it appears the way it does. It's a type 2b diamond, meaning it contains boron impurities that absorb red, yellow, and green light. while allowing blue light to pass through. This gives the diamond its signature color, a vivid grayish blue that appears slightly different depending on the lighting conditions. Diamond also exhibits red phosphorescence, meaning it glows red for a few seconds after being exposed to ultraviolet light. This property, while scientifically interesting, contributed to the diamond's reputation for being somehow supernatural or magical. Imagine showing someone in the 18th century a blue diamond that glowed red in the dark. They'd have no framework for understanding what they were seeing except magic or curse. The size of the diamond is also significant to understanding its history and its legend. At 45.52 carats, it's large enough to be immediately noticeable, but not so large as to be unwearable. You could mount it on a necklace or a brooch and actually wear it to events, which is exactly what many of its owners did. Larger diamonds often become too valuable to wear, kept in vaults and brought out only for major ceremonial occasions. The Hope diamond was big enough to be impressive, but small enough to be part of someone's regular jewelry collection. This meant it was handled more, worn more, incorporated more fully into its owners' daily lives, which in turn meant there were more opportunities for the owner to experience misfortunes that could be attributed to the stone. If we step back and look at the curse legend critically, patterns emerge that suggest how such stories develop and persist. First, most of the people who owned the diamond were already members of extremely high-profile families or social circles. Kings, aristocrats, wealthy heiress and socialites. These are people whose lives were inherently dramatic and well documented. When something bad happened to them, people noticed and remembered. When Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were executed, it was global news. When Evelyn Walsh McLean's son died or her daughter committed suicide, newspapers covered it extensively. The diamond's owners weren't ordinary people experiencing ordinary misfortunes in obscurity. They were famous people experiencing very public tragedies. Second, life in earlier eras was simply more dangerous and unpredictable than modern life. Child mortality was high, medical care was primitive, political violence was common, financial ruin could come suddenly through circumstances entirely beyond individual control. The French aristocrats who wore the diamond didn't die because the diamond cursed them. They died because France underwent a revolution that systematically executed its aristocracy. The Hope family members who struggled financially didn't suffer because of a curse, but because managing inherited wealth across generations is difficult, and many wealthy families eventually lose their fortunes through poor investments, overspending, or simple bad luck. Third, the curse legend was actively promoted by some of the people involved in buying and selling the diamond because it made the stone more interesting and more valuable. Pierre Cartier deliberately embellished the curse story when trying to sell the diamond to Evelyn Walsh McLean. Newspaper reporters writing about the diamond played up the curse angle because it made for better stories than dry recitations of who owned what gem. The curse became part of the diamond's brand, a marketing tool that enhanced its mystique and justified its high price. A cursed diamond was worth more than an ordinary diamond, even if that curse existed only in stories people told. Fourth, confirmation bias plays an enormous role in curse legends. When something bad happens to someone who owns the supposedly cursed object, people say the curse struck again. When nothing bad happens, or when something good happens, people ignore it or explain it away. Harry Winston owned the Hope Diamond for years and experienced no tragedies, but this doesn't disprove the curse in believers' minds, because they can simply say Winston was too practical or too irreverent to be affected, or that the curse was dormant during his ownership. Any evidence that contradicts the curse can be rationalized away, while any evidence that supports it, no matter how circumstantial, is seized upon as proof. The modern visitor to the Smithsonian, standing in front of the diamond's case, has to reconcile two competing narratives. One is the curse story, that tale of stolen property and divine retribution, of misfortune following the stone through centuries and across continents, leaving a trail of destroyed lives in its wake. The other is the scientific and historical account, which explains the diamond as a remarkable mineral specimen with a well-documented provenance, beautiful and valuable certainly, but ultimately just an object with no inherent power to influence human affairs. Most visitors probably hold both narratives simultaneously, enjoying the thrill of the curse story while recognizing intellectually that curses aren't real. But what if we're thinking about curses all wrong? What if the Hope Diamond really is cursed, not through supernatural means, but through the very human, psychological, and social processes its existence triggers? Consider what possessing such an object does to people. It marks them as special, sets them apart, makes them targets for envy and theft. It represents such enormous wealth that it distorts relationships and decision-making. It demands to be displayed, to be shown off, which draws attention and scrutiny that can be dangerous. It's portable wealth, the kind that can be stolen relatively easily compared to land or buildings, which means its owners must constantly worry about security. Owning the Hope Diamond also placed people in specific historical contexts that were often turbulent. The French monarchy owned it during the period leading up to the Revolution. Lord Hope owned it during an era of declining aristocratic power and increasing democratization. The Macleans owned it during the early 20th century, when America's industrial fortunes were proving unstable and new money was displacing old money. In each case, the diamond's owners were navigating complex social changes, and the diamond itself became a symbol of the old order, the ancien régime, the idea that some people simply deserve to possess extraordinary things because of their birth or wealth. That kind of symbolism can be dangerous. The diamond also carried psychological weight for its owners. Evelyn Walsh Maclean wore it constantly, making it part of her identity. When tragedy struck her family, she had to grapple with the question of whether the diamond had somehow caused them. Even if she didn't believe in curses rationally, the doubt must have been there, gnawing at her. That doubt, that psychological burden, could have contributed to her alcoholism and her other struggles. The diamond became a weight around her neck in more ways than one, a constant reminder that she owned something extraordinary and possibly dangerous, that she had perhaps claimed something she shouldn't have. There's also the question of whether the curse legend influenced events through a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you believe you own a cursed object, you might make decisions differently. You might take fewer risks, or alternatively, you might take more risks, figuring you're doomed anyway. You might interpret ordinary misfortunes as manifestations of the curse, which could deepen depression or anxiety and lead to worse outcomes. Your relationships might suffer if people around you believe in the curse and want to avoid being near you or the object. The curse doesn't have to be metaphysically real to have real-world effects on behavior and psychology. From a gemological perspective, the Hope Diamond is fascinating for reasons having nothing to do with curses. Its color is exceptionally rare and beautiful, the result of a specific type of geological formation that occurred deep in the earth under precise conditions of heat and pressure. The crystal structure is remarkably pure, with few inclusions or flaws, which is unusual for a diamond of that size. The stone has been studied extensively by scientists interested in understanding its properties, and it has contributed to our knowledge of how diamonds form and how trace elements affect their appearance. In a very real sense, the diamond has advanced human knowledge, which seems like a blessing rather than a curse. The diamond's journey also tells us something about how we value objects and construct meaning around them. The stone itself hasn't changed in any fundamental way since it was formed billions of years ago. It's the same arrangement of carbon atoms, whether it sits in a Hindu temple, on a French king's crown, around an American heiress's neck, or in a museum case. But the meaning we assign to it has changed constantly. It's been a religious icon, a symbol of royal power, a trophy of colonialism, a cursed talisman, a collector's prize, and finally a public educational specimen. Each owner and each era projected different meanings onto the same physical object. This projection of meaning is really what the curse legend is about at its core. The story of the Hope Diamond curse is a story about how humans try to make sense of suffering and misfortune by creating narratives that impose order on chaos. When bad things happened to people who owned the diamond, observers looked for patterns and causes. The curse provided both. A simple explanation that tied disparate tragedies together into a coherent story with a clear beginning in that supposed temple theft. The real explanation for why Louis XVI was executed, or why Evelyn Walsh McLean's son died, complicated historical forces, medical randomness, human error, was far less satisfying than a curse that explained everything. The persistence of the curse legend also reveals something about what we want from our stories about wealth and power. There's a deep human desire to believe that ill-gotten gains will be punished, that those who take what isn't theirs will suffer consequences, that the universe has some built-in justice mechanism. The Hope Diamond curse legend serves this psychological need perfectly. It suggests that you can't simply steal something sacred and beautiful and expect to enjoy it without consequences. It promises that there are forces beyond human law that will exact revenge for violations of cosmic order. This is a comforting thought for people who see injustice go unpunished in the real world. Yet the actual history of the diamond suggests a more mundane reality. Most of its owners did suffer various misfortunes, but so does everyone given enough time. The question isn't whether bad things happened to people who owned the diamond. It's whether bad things happened at rates significantly higher than statistical chance would predict for people of similar social position and era. When you control for factors like the high mortality rates of pre-modern eras, the political instability of revolutionary periods, and the personal problems common among the extremely wealthy, the diamond's owners don't appear unusually unlucky. They appear normally lucky for their circumstances, which is to say they experienced a mix of fortune and misfortune that falls within expected parameters. The diamond's time in the Smithsonian has lasted longer now than many of its previous ownerships. It's been on display since 1958, weathering decades without apparent incident. The museum hasn't suffered unusual misfortunes. The curators and guards who work with the diamond haven't reported mysterious ailments or tragedies. Millions of visitors have stood in front of its case, and while I'm sure some of those individuals have subsequently experienced misfortunes, they've experienced them at rates no different from the general population. If the curse were real and transferable through mere proximity, the Smithsonian would be the unluckiest place in America. What the diamond has done during its museum years is educate. The exhibit explains not just the curse legend, but also the actual geology and history of the stone. Visitors learn about diamond formation, about the Golconda mines, about the gem trade, about the scientific properties that make this particular diamond unusual. Children stare at it and become interested in mineralogy. Students study it and learn about crystallography. The diamond has become a teaching tool, serving a purpose beyond simply being beautiful or valuable. Perhaps this is its best fate, neither cursed nor hoarded, but shared with everyone who wants to see it. Standing in front of the Hope Diamond, looking at that extraordinary blue color, it's easy to understand why people have coveted it and why they've woven such elaborate stories around it. Beautiful things inspire powerful emotions, and powerful emotions demand explanations. The curse legend is one such explanation, a way of processing the feelings that arise when confronted with something so extraordinary that it seems to transcend ordinary physical reality. The diamond doesn't need to be actually cursed to provoke thoughts about fate, justice, mortality, and the price of beauty. Its mere existence is enough to make us contemplate these deeper questions. The truth about the Hope Diamond is probably simpler and stranger than either the curse legend or the pure scientific explanation suggests. It's a rock, yes, but a rock that has moved through human history, accumulating stories and meanings like a snowball rolling downhill accumulates snow. Each owner, each era, each telling of its story has added layers of interpretation that now seem inseparable from the object itself. The diamond in the Smithsonian case is simultaneously the original geological formation, the accumulated history of its human interactions, and the legends that have been spun around those interactions. You can't look at it and see only the rock any more than you can look at it and see only the curse. You see all of it at once, multiple realities layered on top of each other, and that complexity is perhaps more interesting than any single narrative could be. The Knights Templar's hidden treasure. The autumn rain hammered against the limestone walls of the Templar commandery in Poitou, France, as Brother Guillaume pressed his weathered hands against the cold stone table. Before him lay a rolled parchment sealed with wax, bearing the unmistakable cross pate of the order. The year was 1307, and whispers of King Philip's intentions had reached even this remote outpost. "They will come for us," said Brother Arnaud, his younger companion, voice trembling slightly. "The king's men are already moving through Paris. They arrested Grand Master de Molay at dawn 3 days ago." Guillaume nodded slowly, his grey beard catching the firelight from the hearth. He had served the order for 43 years, since he was barely 14, and had witnessed the fall of Acre, the last Christian stronghold in the Holy Land. He had carried secrets across the Mediterranean, guarded treasures in the vaults beneath the Paris temple. Now, in the twilight of his service, he faced the greatest task of all. Then we have less time than I hoped, Guillaume said, breaking the seal on the parchment. His eyes scanned the Latin script, written in the distinctive hand of the Order's treasurer. The instructions are clear. We are to move the contents of the vault to the designated location. The maps have been divided among 7 commanderies, and we hold the 3rd key. The treasure of the Knights Templar was not simply gold and silver, though there was plenty of that. Over 2 centuries, the warrior monks had accumulated wealth that rivaled kingdoms. They had established the first international banking system, holding deposits for nobles, merchants, and even rival monarchs. Their fleet controlled trade routes across the Mediterranean. But the true treasure, the one that made kings tremble and popes uneasy, was knowledge, documents, relics, and secrets gathered from the ancient world. Guillaume rose from the table and moved to the eastern wall of the chamber. He counted 7 stones from the corner and pressed against a particular block. With a grinding sound, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. Arno lit a torch, and together they descended into the depths beneath the commandery. The vault was not large, but what it contained was priceless. Wooden chests bound with iron bands lined the walls. Guillaume knew their contents intimately. Each had been catalogued and committed to memory. There were Byzantine manuscripts rescued from Constantinople, scrolls recovered from the libraries of Alexandria through intermediaries in Cairo, astronomical charts from Muslim scholars, and documents that challenged the very foundations of the Church's teachings. In the center of the vault stood a stone altar, and upon it rested an object wrapped in crimson silk. Guillaume approached it reverently, his hands trembling not from age but from the weight of what he touched. He unwrapped the silk carefully, revealing a copper scroll covered in ancient Hebrew script. "Is that—" Arno began, his voice barely a whisper. "The copper scroll from Qumran," Guillaume confirmed, "one of the Dead Sea texts, describes the locations of treasures hidden before the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. The Order acquired it 30 years ago through contacts in the East. Some say it is merely symbolic, but I have studied it. The measurements are too precise, the locations too specific. It is genuine." But there was more. Behind the altar, wrapped in oilcloth, was something that Guillaume had been sworn to protect above all else. He carefully removed the covering, revealing a wooden box of acacia wood, its surface covered with gold leaf and intricate carvings. The craftsmanship was unmistakably ancient, predating even Rome itself. "What is it?" Arno asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Guillaume hesitated. The younger knight had taken his vows, had proven himself in battle, but some secrets were almost too dangerous to share. Yet, if Guillaume fell, if King Philip's men captured or killed him, someone else needed to know. "There are legends," Guillaume began, "of what the first Templars found beneath Solomon's temple in Jerusalem. Most believe we discovered gold, perhaps the treasures of Herod, but the 9 knights who established our order spent 9 years excavating beneath the Temple Mount. What would take 9 years to find?" He opened the box carefully. Inside, nestled in aged linen, were fragments of stone tablets, the Hebrew letters still visible despite their great age. Beside them lay several papyrus scrolls, their edges crumbling, but their contents preserved by the dry climate of their original resting place. "These tablets," Guillaume said, his voice heavy with significance, are said to be fragments of the original stones carried down from Mount Sinai. The scrolls contain teachings that were never included in the approved scripture, texts that show a very different understanding of the divine than what Rome permits. Arnaud's face paled. If the church knew. They do know, or at least suspect, Guillaume replied. Why else would King Philip move against us so suddenly? The order has become too powerful, too independent. We answer to no king, only to the Pope, and even Rome fears what we might reveal. Philip needs our wealth to pay his debts, but he also needs to ensure these secrets never surface. For 3 nights, the 2 knights worked tirelessly. They removed the contents of the vault, carefully packing everything into leather satchels and wooden crates designed to be carried by horse. The gold and silver were separated. Some would be buried in locations marked on the fractured map, insurance for the order's future. But the documents, the scrolls, the tablets, these would be moved together to a single location where they could be protected. On the 4th morning, a messenger arrived, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. Guillaume recognized him as Brother Michel from the Tour Commandery. "They are coming," Michel gasped, accepting a cup of water. The king's seneschal rides with 300 men. They have orders to arrest every Templar in France and seize all property. I rode through the night to warn you. Guillaume glanced at Arnaud. How much time? A day, perhaps less. They were making camp at Loudun when I passed them. It would have to be enough. Guillaume had already arranged for a ship, a Templar vessel that had been loading cargo in La Rochelle for the past week, ostensibly bound for Scotland with wool and wine. The captain was a man Guillaume trusted, someone who owed the order his life and would ask no questions. They loaded the horses under cover of darkness. 12 animals in total, 8 carrying the treasure, 4 for the riders. Guillaume, Arnaud, Michel, and a 4th knight, Brother Thomas, who served as the commandery's military commander. Each man wore plain clothing, their Templar mantles hidden in their saddlebags. They could not risk being identified on the road. The journey to La Rochelle normally took 3 days, but Guillaume pushed them hard, staying off the main roads, cutting through forests and following old Roman paths that few remembered. They paused only briefly to rest the horses and snatch a few hours of sleep in abandoned shepherds' huts or beneath the shelter of ancient oaks. On the 2nd day, as they forded a stream in the Vendée, Arnaud spotted riders in the distance. 5 men, wearing the king's colours, moving parallel to their position. Guillaume made a quick decision. They couldn't risk a confrontation. Even if they prevailed, the alarm would be raised. "There's a forest ahead," Thomas said, studying the landscape. "Thick growth, difficult for horses. We could lose them there." They urged their mounts forward, the pack animals protesting the increased pace. Behind them, the royal men-at-arms had spotted them and gave chase. Guillaume felt his heart pounding, not from fear for himself, but from the terror that 2 centuries of accumulated knowledge might fall into the wrong hands. The forest was dense with oak and beech, the undergrowth thick with brambles. They plunged into it, the branches clawing at their clothing. Behind them came shouts, the sound of horses crashing through brush. Guillaume led them deeper, following a path that Thomas had used years before when hunting in these woods. They emerged into a clearing, and for a moment, Guillaume thought they were trapped, but Thomas pointed to a narrow ravine. barely visible behind a screen of ferns. This way. The ravine was steep, the descent treacherous, but the pack horses were mountain-bred and sure-footed. They picked their way down carefully, while behind them the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The king's men, unfamiliar with the terrain, had lost them in the dense forest. By nightfall, they reached the outskirts of La Rochelle. The port city was bustling even at this late hour, ships being loaded by torchlight, merchants arguing over cargo manifests, sailors singing in taverns near the docks. Guillaume led them to a warehouse near the harbour, identified by a small carved cross above the door, a Templar safe house. The warehouse keeper, an old sailor named Pierre, who had lost his leg in service to the order, opened the door quickly and ushered them inside. The ship awaits, Brother Guillaume. Captain Jean has been asking for you. The tide turns at dawn, and he wishes to depart immediately. They worked through the night, transferring the cargo from horses to ship. The vessel was a sturdy cog, broad-beamed and built for Atlantic waters, with a single mast and a crew of 20. Captain Jean was a Breton, his face weathered by years at sea, his eyes sharp and calculating. "Scotland?" Guillaume asked, as the last of the crates were loaded into the hold. "Eventually," Jean replied, "but we'll stop first at several ports along the way. If we're being followed, I want to lay false trails. We'll put in at Bordeaux, claim we're heading to England. Then we'll sail north to Brittany, spread word that we're trading with Ireland. By the time anyone figures out our true destination, we'll be long gone." Guillaume approved. The captain was thinking ahead, protecting not just this voyage, but future operations. The order had been betrayed, but it was not destroyed, not yet. As dawn broke over La Rochelle, the ship slipped its moorings and moved out into the harbour. Guillaume stood at the rail, watching the city recede into the morning mist. Somewhere behind them, King Philip's men were ransacking Templar properties, arresting knights, seizing assets. But the true treasure of the order was safely aboard this vessel, sailing toward a new home. The voyage was not easy. They encountered storms off the Breton coast that tested even Captain Jean's considerable skill. The Atlantic in October was unforgiving, with waves that towered over the ship's rail and winds that threatened to tear the sail from its rigging. Guillaume spent much of the journey below decks, securing the cargo, ensuring that nothing was damaged by the constant pitching and rolling. Brother Arnaud proved to have a weak stomach for sea travel, and spent 3 days barely able to lift his head. Michel fared better, helping the crew with their work, his muscular frame useful in managing the heavy canvas and thick ropes. Thomas stood watch, his soldier's instincts keeping him alert for any sign of pursuit, though on the empty ocean there was little threat beyond the elements themselves. After 10 days at sea, they reached the Scottish coast. Captain Jean guided the ship through treacherous waters, past rocky outcrops and hidden reefs, following a passage that only local pilots knew. They anchored in a secluded bay on the western coast, where steep cliffs provided natural protection and dense forests came almost to the water's edge. Guillaume had chosen this location carefully, years before, when it became clear that the Order's position in France was becoming precarious. Scotland was beyond the reach of Philip's power, and King Robert the Bruce, excommunicated by the Pope and locked in a struggle for his throne, had no love for the church hierarchy that condemned him. He would welcome Templar gold and Templar knights, and in return he would offer protection. But Guillaume's destination was not a castle or a city. Deep in the Scottish Highlands, in a valley accessible only by a single narrow pass, stood the ruins of an ancient monastery. It had been built centuries ago by Irish monks, long before the Norse raids, and had been abandoned for 200 years. The locals avoided it, claiming it was haunted, which suited Guillaume's purposes perfectly. They transferred the cargo to pack horses again, animals purchased from a local laird who asked no questions when presented with good silver. The journey inland took another week, following paths that were barely more than game trails, climbing into mountains where mist clung to the peaks, and rain fell almost constantly. The valley, when they finally reached it, was exactly as Guillaume remembered from his single previous visit, 20 years earlier. A narrow gorge opened into a sheltered basin, surrounded on all sides by steep slopes. A stream ran through the center, feeding a small lake. The ruins of the monastery stood on a slight rise above the water, its stone walls still largely intact despite centuries of neglect. "This is where we hide the treasure of the order?" Arnaud asked, unable to keep the disappointment from his voice. He had perhaps expected something more dramatic, more befitting the legends. Guillaume smiled. "This is where we preserve it, yes, but not in the ruins themselves. Come." He led them past the crumbling monastery to the base of the cliff that formed the valley's northern wall. Water seeped from the rock face, creating a perpetually wet surface covered in moss and ferns. Guillaume pushed aside the vegetation, revealing the opening of a cave. "Natural?" Thomas asked, studying the entrance with a military eye. "In part," Guillaume replied, "but expanded long ago. The Irish monks used it as a crypt. There are chambers inside, carved from the living rock, dry, cool, perfect for preserving documents." They spent the next month preparing the cave system. Using tools they had brought with them, they carved deeper chambers, created ventilation shafts disguised as natural fissures, and built hidden doorways that could be sealed from within. The gold and silver were divided, some buried in scattered locations throughout the valley, others placed in chambers within the cave, sealed behind false walls that appeared to be solid rock. The documents, scrolls, and relics were given the greatest care. Guillaume constructed wooden shelves, treated with oils to resist moisture. Each scroll was wrapped individually in oiled leather, each document placed between boards of cedar wood. The stone tablets were set into recesses carved specifically for them, protected by multiple layers of sealing. As winter approached and the first snows began to fall in the highlands, Guillaume knew their work was nearly complete. He gathered the 3 knights in the main chamber of the cave, where a small fire provided light and warmth. "What we have preserved here must remain hidden until the time is right for it to be revealed," he said, his voice echoing slightly off the stone walls. "The order may be scattered, our brothers imprisoned or worse, but our legacy endures. The knowledge we have gathered, the truths we have discovered, they are more valuable than all the gold in Christendom." He produced a leather journal from his pack, its pages covered in his own careful handwriting. "I have created this guide for those who come after us. It contains the key to understanding what we have hidden. Here, descriptions of the most important documents, and instructions for interpreting the copper scroll. But the journal itself is encrypted, using a cipher known only to senior members of the Order. And if the Order is destroyed," Michel asked quietly, "if there is no one left who knows the cipher?" Guillaume had considered this possibility. then we must ensure the knowledge survives in other ways. Thomas, you will return to France carefully in disguise. Find any surviving brothers and pass word of this location. Use the old signs, the marks that only we understand. Arno, you will go to Portugal, where some of our number have found refuge under a different name. Tell them what we have accomplished here. Michelle, you will remain in Scotland, establish yourself, perhaps marry, have children, pass down the knowledge in your family, code it in stories and songs, so that even if the order fades from memory, there will be those who remember. And you, Brother Guillaume? Arnaud asked. I am old, Guillaume said simply. My task is complete. I will remain here, in this valley, as guardian. When spring comes, you will build me a small dwelling near the cave entrance. I will live out my remaining years, ensuring that what we have hidden remains secure. The three younger knights tried to protest, but Guillaume raised his hand. This is not punishment, but privilege. I have spent my life in service to the Order, and I can think of no better way to end it than as the keeper of our greatest treasure. Besides, someone must remain. If the entrance is left unguarded, if shepherds or hunters stumble upon it, everything we have risked will be for nothing. Through that first winter, Guillaume lived in a simple stone hut the knights constructed for him before departing on their separate missions. The structure was built against the base of the cliff, using stones from the ruined monastery, with a roof of slate and timber. A small hearth provided warmth, and the stream offered fresh water and fish. Guillaume had provisions enough to last until spring, when he could plant a small garden. The solitude did not trouble him. After decades of communal living in Templar commanderies, where silence was often enforced but privacy rare, he found the isolation almost restful. His days fell into a rhythm: morning prayers, maintenance of the cave and its contents, foraging for food, and in the evenings, by firelight, he worked on his journal, adding details, refining the cipher, ensuring that his knowledge would not die with him. Spring came late to the highlands, but when it arrived, the valley transformed. Wildflowers covered the meadows, birds returned to nest in the cliffs, and the stream swelled with snowmelt. Guillaume planted barley and turnips, tended a small flock of sheep he had traded for with the nearest settlement, and gradually transformed his temporary shelter into a permanent hermitage. Months passed into years. Guillaume aged, his beard turning completely white, his movements slower but still purposeful. He marked the passage of time by carving notches into a wooden staff, one for each month. He prayed for his brothers in the Order, wondering how many had survived the king's persecution. He knew that Grand Master Jacques de Molay had been burned at the stake in Paris, and that hundreds of other Templars had been tortured, imprisoned, or killed. But he also knew that many had escaped, had found refuge in places beyond Philip's reach. In the third year of his guardianship, a visitor arrived. Guillaume was working in his garden when he heard a horse approaching. His hand went instinctively to the sword he still kept close, though he was now 70 years old and doubted he could put up much of a fight. But when the rider emerged from the narrow pass, Guillaume recognized the travel-worn face of Brother Michel. "You've returned," Guillaume said, embracing his former companion. "I bring news," Michel replied. "Much has happened in the world beyond this valley. The Order has been officially dissolved by papal decree, our properties distributed to the Hospitallers, our name condemned. But there are survivors, scattered groups who maintain the traditions in secret. Some have joined other orders, some have simply disappeared into ordinary life, but they remember. They sat by Guillaume's fire that night, while Michel shared his news. He had indeed established himself in Scotland, married a local woman, and now had 2 young sons. He worked as a merchant, his Templar past carefully hidden, but he maintained contact with others who had escaped the purge. There was an underground network, he explained, of former Templars and their descendants, passing messages through coded letters and secret symbols. "There's more," Michel said, his voice dropping. "There's a legend spreading, particularly in France. People say that the Templar treasure was never found, that it was smuggled away before the arrests. Some claim it was taken to Scotland, others say Portugal or Cyprus. There are treasure hunters, adventurers, and agents of various kings searching for it." Guillaume nodded slowly. He had anticipated this. "Have any come close?" "Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. That's why I've come. We need to add additional protections, create false trails, ensure that if someone does find this valley, they won't easily discover what lies beneath." Over the following weeks, they worked together to enhance the cave's concealment. They created a false chamber near the entrance, placing some items of moderate value, old coins, a few pieces of silver plate, some unremarkable documents, where they could be found. Any treasure hunter discovering this decoy would believe they had found the Templar cache and might not search further. The true treasure, deeper in the cave system, was hidden behind sealed passages that appeared to be natural walls. They also created markers, symbols that would mean nothing to outsiders but would guide initiated members of the order to the valley. Guillaume knew that as time passed and he eventually died, there needed to be a way for others to find what had been hidden. So they carved subtle signs into rocks along the approach route. A cross here, a geometric pattern there, markers that would endure for centuries if properly maintained. Michel stayed for 3 months before departing again, promising to return when he could. Guillaume resumed his solitary existence, but now with a renewed sense of purpose. He was not just guarding the treasure, but maintaining a beacon for the future, a light that would guide those who came seeking truth. More years passed. Guillaume's body grew weaker, but his mind remained sharp. He transferred more of his knowledge into his journal, knowing that his time was limited. He wrote about the significance of each major document in the collection, explained the context of the relics, and provided his own translations and interpretations of the most important texts. One document in particular had occupied much of his later research, a gospel, not one of the 4 approved by the Church, but an account attributed to Mary Magdalene herself. The order had acquired it from a monastery in Ethiopia, where such alternative scriptures had been preserved by their isolated Christian community. Guillaume had spent years studying it, comparing it with other texts in the collection, and he was convinced of its authenticity. The Gospel presented a very different picture of Christ's mission, emphasizing spiritual knowledge over blind faith, suggesting that salvation came through understanding rather than through the institutional church. It was easy to see why such texts had been suppressed. They challenged the very foundation of ecclesiastical authority. But Guillaume believed that truth, however uncomfortable, deserved to be preserved. In the year 1320, 13 years after he had first entered the valley, Guillaume knew his end was approaching. His heart troubled him, his breathing was laboured, and he could no longer work in the garden or tend the sheep. He spent his final days in the cave itself, among the treasures he had protected for so long. His journal opened before him as he added his final entries. He wrote instructions for whoever would find his body and his journal. He explained how to access the sealed chambers, how to interpret the cipher he had used, and most importantly, he wrote why these things mattered. Knowledge, he insisted, was humanity's greatest treasure, more valuable than gold because it could not be stolen, could not corrode, could only grow and compound over generations. On a cold morning in late autumn, Guillaume died peacefully in the cave, his hand resting on the wooden box containing the stone tablets, his journal beside him. His body was discovered weeks later by a shepherd who had ventured into the valley seeking lost sheep. The man, frightened by finding a corpse in what locals considered a haunted place, quickly retreated and told no one except the village priest. The priest, a former Templar sergeant named Edmund, who had escaped persecution by taking holy orders under a false name, recognized the description of the dead man and understood immediately what it meant. He traveled to the valley, found Guillaume's body, and gave him a proper burial in the small cemetery beside the ruined monastery. And then, understanding his duty, Edmund took Guillaume's journal and added his own name to the list of guardians. For the next 2 centuries, the valley remained protected by a succession of such guardians, each one a descendant or associate of the Templar network that had survived underground. They lived as hermits, shepherds, or monks, maintaining the valley's isolation while ensuring the cave and its contents remained undisturbed. The journal passed from hand to hand, each guardian adding their own entries, recording historical events, noting changes to the hiding places, and preserving the knowledge of the cipher. By the early 16th century, during the upheaval of the Reformation, the guardianship had passed to a family of Scottish Protestants who saw the preserved documents as ammunition against Catholic Rome. They understood that the alternative Gospels and ancient texts could support their arguments for a return to a purer, earlier Christianity. But they also recognized the danger. Revealing the treasure too soon, before the time was right, might lead to its destruction rather than its vindication. The guardian in 1547 was a woman named Isabel MacLeod, granddaughter of the previous keeper, who had learned the secrets of the valley from her father after her older brothers died in clan warfare. She was unusual for her time, literate, educated in Latin and Greek, and fiercely protective of her charge. She copied portions of the hidden documents, making translations that she could share with trusted scholars without revealing the existence of the original texts. One of these scholars was a young mathematician and astronomer named John Napier, who would later become famous for inventing logarithms. Isabel showed him astronomical texts from the Templar collection, calculations made by Persian and Arab scholars that were far in advance of European knowledge. These texts influenced Napier's own work, though he never knew their true source. Isabel made another crucial contribution to the treasure's preservation. She created a comprehensive map of the valley and cave system, showing not just the location of the hidden chambers, but also the meanings of the various symbols and markers. She appended this map to Guillaume's journal, which had grown considerably over the centuries, and she instituted a practice that would continue for generations. Each guardian would create a copy of the most essential information and hide it in a separate location, insurance against the loss of the main journal. The 17th century brought new dangers. the English Civil War spilled into Scotland, armies marched across the Highlands, and refugees fled into remote areas seeking safety. Twice the valley was nearly discovered by soldiers, and once by a group of Covenanters fleeing persecution. Each time, the Guardian managed to convince the intruders that the valley was cursed or haunted, encouraging them to move on quickly. By 1700, the direct line of Templar descendants had thinned considerably. Many had died without heirs, others had emigrated to the New World, and some had simply lost interest in maintaining the ancient trust. The guardianship passed to a Catholic family, the Frasers, who had their own reasons for protecting secrets from Protestant authorities. They understood that the documents in the cave could be dangerous to both Catholic and Protestant establishments, proving that both sides had distorted early Christian teachings to suit their own purposes. Throughout the 18th century, the Enlightenment brought new interest in ancient texts and historical mysteries. Scholars began to seriously study comparative religion, to question traditional narratives, and to seek out alternative sources. The guardians of the valley began to wonder if perhaps the time had finally come to reveal at least some of what had been hidden. In 1776, a young scholar named William Fraser, current guardian, made contact with Adam Weishaupt in Bavaria. Weishaupt had founded an organization dedicated to preserving and propagating Enlightenment ideals against religious obscurantism. William provided him with copies of some of the philosophical texts from the collection, though not the most sensitive materials. This connection would later give rise to conspiracy theories linking the Templars, the Illuminati, and various other secret societies, most of which were based on misunderstandings and exaggerations. The French Revolution nearly proved disastrous for the treasure. Revolutionary fervour against the church and aristocracy included hatred of the Templars, who were seen as symbols of medieval corruption. Treasure hunters, newly emboldened, began searching more aggressively for Templar caches throughout Europe. Several expeditions came to Scotland following rumours and legends, though none found the hidden valley. As the 19th century progressed, the guardianship faced a new challenge: modernisation. Railways were being built across Scotland, remote areas were being mapped and surveyed, and the valley's isolation could not be guaranteed forever. In 1842, the Guardian, a schoolteacher named Robert Cameron, made a momentous decision. He began to slowly, carefully, move some of the most important documents to other locations. This was controversial even among the small network of people who knew about the treasure. Some argued that dispersing the collection increased the risk of discovery or loss, but Robert argued persuasively that having everything in one location was itself a risk. Fire, flood, landslide, or discovery could destroy it all in one stroke. Better to distribute the materials, creating redundancy and increasing the chances that something would survive to the modern era. Over 20 years, Robert systematically moved documents. Some went to private collections, their true significance hidden among other manuscripts. Some were donated anonymously to university libraries, where they were catalogued as minor curiosities of uncertain provenance. The most sensitive materials, the stone tablets, the copper scroll, the alternative gospels, remained in the cave, but now they had companions scattered across Scotland, England, and even France. Robert also did something else revolutionary. He photographed the documents. Photography was still a new technology, but Robert recognized its potential. He created a photographic record of the collection. multiple copies hidden in bank vaults and with trusted associates. Now, even if the originals were lost, their contents would survive. The 20th century brought unprecedented changes. 2 world wars sent armies across Europe again. Governments became more intrusive and capable of surveillance, and nowhere remained truly remote. In 1942, fearing Nazi interest in occult artifacts and esoteric knowledge, the Guardian at that time moved the remaining items from the cave to a new location, a specially constructed vault beneath Manor House in the lowlands. This final move marked the end of the Valley's role in the story. The cave was empty now, its secrets dispersed, its guardianship passed into history. But the tradition continued. There were still people who knew about the Templar treasure, who protected the journal and its copies, who ensured that the dispersed documents remained safe. In the late 20th century, scholars began publishing research on the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Nag Hammadi Library, and other ancient texts that challenged traditional religious narratives. Some of these scholars, unknowingly, were working with documents that had come from the Templar collection, materials that had been hidden for 7 centuries before gradually making their way into academic circulation. The story might have ended there, another medieval mystery partially solved by modern scholarship. But in 2003, a historian named Dr. Sarah Chen made an unexpected discovery. While researching Templar history in Scotland, she found a reference in an old parish record to a hermit in the Highlands who had been buried with great ceremony in 1320. The description of the location matched no known monastic site, and the elaborate burial seemed odd for a simple hermit. Following this lead, Dr. Chen spent months searching, using modern mapping technology, satellite imagery, and hiking through remote valleys. She found the ruins of the old monastery, the remnants of stone huts, and finally, the cave. It was empty, of course, but on the walls, barely visible beneath centuries of grime and mineral deposits, she found carved symbols, crosses, geometric patterns, and marks that matched Templar iconography. She also found something else. A sealed ceramic jar hidden in a crack in the cave ceiling, placed so cleverly that it had been missed by all previous occupants. Inside was a letter written in Latin, dated 1862. It was from Robert Cameron, the guardian who had dispersed the collection. He had left this message for whoever finally discovered the cave, explaining in general terms what had been hidden there and why. If you read this, the letter said, it means the valley's secret has finally been revealed. Do not despair that you have not found gold or jewels. The true treasure of the Templars was never material wealth, but knowledge. Knowledge that challenges, enlightens, and transforms. Much of what we protected has now, through various means, found its way into the world. It lives in libraries, in universities, in the minds of scholars who study texts they do not realize were preserved by warrior monks 7 centuries ago. The guardianship has ended because it succeeded. The light that the Templars kindled has not been extinguished, but has spread beyond any cave or vault to illuminate the world. Dr. Chen published her findings in a carefully worded academic paper. She described finding the cave and the letter, discussed the historical evidence for a Templar presence in Scotland, and suggested that some materials from Templar archives might have survived and been integrated into later collections. She did not reveal everything the letter contained. Some secrets were still too sensitive, some connections too dangerous to make explicit. But she understood now the larger truth. The Knights Templar's hidden treasure had never been lost. It had been carefully, methodically, brilliantly preserved and dispersed over 7 centuries by a succession of dedicated guardians. Pieces of it lived in museums, libraries, private collections, and scholarly publications around the world. The knowledge that Guillaume and his companions had risked everything to protect had achieved exactly what they hoped. It had survived, it had spread, and it continued to challenge and enlighten those who encountered it. In her office at the university, Dr. Chen kept a photograph of the empty cave and a translation of Cameron's letter. Sometimes she wondered about the journal, the original chronicle that Guillaume had begun in 1307, and that had grown for centuries. Where was it now? Who held it? Was there still a guardian somewhere, maintaining the ancient trust? She suspected she would never know, and perhaps that was appropriate. Some mysteries deserved to remain mysteries, not because truth should be hidden, but because the search for truth was itself valuable. The Templars had understood this. They had been, above all else, seekers, seeking not just to protect what was known, but to preserve the possibility of knowing, to keep alive the human capacity for wonder, questioning, and discovery. The real treasure, Dr. Chen realized, was not objects but ideas. It was the understanding that truth was too important to be controlled by any single institution, that knowledge belonged to humanity rather than to kings or popes, and that the greatest service one could perform was to ensure that light, however small, continued to shine through the darkness of ignorance and oppression. 700 years after Guillaume closed the cave for the first time, his mission was complete. The treasure of the Knights Templar had been found because it had never truly been lost. It had simply been waiting, patient and enduring, for the world to be ready to receive it. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World. The sea was a slow, breathing thing that night, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. Above it, the sky curved vast and dark, its stars pricked into existence like tiny fires along the roof of the world. A longship rode those gentle swells, its dragon-headed prow cutting a quiet path through the moonlit water. The oars were drawn in, the sail slack, and the men aboard lay in cloaks and furs, drifting in a shallow, watchful sleep. Only one figure remained fully awake. Leif stood near the prow, one hand resting on the carved dragon's neck, his other hand wrapped around the leather strap of his cloak as the wind nudged at him. The air smelled of salt and old ice, like the breath of the northern seas he had known since childhood. Somewhere behind them, far beyond the curve of the ocean, lay Greenland, with its sharp cliffs and scattered settlements pressed up against the edge of the world they believed they knew. Ahead, there was only darkness and the whisper of something more. He listened to the water stroking the hull, the faint creak of wood, the soft exhale of sleeping men. It felt to him as though the ship moved not just across the ocean, but across time and memory, gliding toward a story that had been waiting centuries to be told his father's tales. The rumors told in Icelandic halls, the whispered accounts of a strange shoreline found by accident. All of them drifted through his mind like low clouds. They said there was land out here, land beyond Greenland, beyond the shifting floes and cold fogs, land with forests so thick you could walk among trees for days, land with rivers that ran clear and deep, land where grapes grew wild, where game was plentiful, where the air itself seemed gentler. Some had laughed at the idea, others had shrugged and let it pass like any other tale told next to a fire. But the story had grown roots in Leif's mind and taken hold. Now, as the ship glided under the stars, he felt that story pulling him forward. A soft footstep sounded behind him. "You do not sleep," came a low voice. Leif turned slightly. It was Tyrkir, the older man who had travelled with his family for so long. He was as much kin as any blood relative. His hair was threaded with grey, his beard thick, his eyes bright even in the dim light. "Someone should watch the sea," Leif murmured. "The sea will still be here in the morning," Tyrkir replied gently. "It always is." Leif's gaze slipped back to the horizon, though there was nothing to see but darkness and the faint line where sea met sky. "Do you remember," he asked quietly, "what my father said about the land to the west?" Tyrkir stepped up beside him, pulling his cloak tighter around his shoulders. "I remember many things your father said. Some of them were wise, some were spoken after too much mead." A faint smile touched his lips. "But yes, I remember. A coast glimpsed in bad weather. A ship blown off course strange woods. No settlements, only the promise of what might be." Leif nodded slowly. "It feels close, as if we have been drifting toward it our whole lives without knowing." "Stories have a way of doing that," Tyrkir said. "They lie in wait until someone is willing to sail far enough to meet them." The wind shifted, stroking the sail. Somewhere in the darkness, a wave rose a little higher than the others, and then slumped beneath the hull with a soft, hollow sound. The motion swayed the men sleeping along the benches, but they did not wake. The night seemed to fold around the ship like a cloak, isolating it in a small moving circle of creaks and whispers. "Sleep, Leif," Tyrkir said at last. "Morning will come whether you watch for it or not, and you will need clear eyes when it does." Leif hesitated, then nodded. He gave the dragon's head a final, absent pat, as if to reassure the ship itself, and made his way back toward the center of the longship. He lay down among his men, the boards cool beneath him, his cloak scratching lightly against his cheek. The motion of the sea cradled him, slow and patient. His thoughts drifted backward, to Greenland, to Iceland, to the tales of the old country across the ocean, but always, like a needle returning to north, his mind turned toward that unnamed shore ahead. He imagined it dimly, a line of land appearing out of morning mist, and as the rocking lulled him at last toward sleep, he felt as though that distant coastline was already watching them approach. Morning stole into the sky gradually, the stars fading one by one, as if some unseen hand were gently snuffing them out. A pale band of light appeared in the east, spreading across the water until the sea shivered with brightness. The men stirred, rolling in their cloaks, blinking at the day. Oars were quietly shifted. A few muttered prayers. Someone coughed, the sound swallowed quickly by the open air. Leif rose, his muscles stiff, but his thoughts sharp. The wind had strengthened, and the sail now caught it, full and rounded, drawing the ship forward with renewed purpose. Foam hissed along the sides. Above, a few seabirds circled, white and grey against the lightning sky. He watched them, feeling his heart quicken. "We are still far from known waters," one of the men murmured, stepping to stand beside him. It was Bjarni, broad-shouldered, with sunburned cheeks and a steady gaze. "Yet there are birds." Birds mean land, Leaf replied quietly. Somewhere ahead, somewhere near. They do not drift so far from shore for nothing. They sailed on. The hours of the day seemed to stretch and thin, like threads pulled slowly from a loom. The men rowed in turns when the wind slackened, their oars dipping in and out of the water with the slow, unhurried rhythm of practiced work. When the breeze returned, they rested, letting the ship glide. They ate simply, dried fish, bread hard as wood, water carefully portioned, and spoke little. The ocean had a way of taking speech and folding it back into itself until silence felt more natural. But in each quiet glance toward the horizon, there was an unspoken question. As afternoon leaned toward evening, the world shifted. A darker line appeared along the edge of the water, so faint at first it was easy to mistake it for a trick of light, or a cloud bank hanging low. Yet as the longship moved steadily forward, that line did not dissolve. Instead, it grew more distinct, separating itself from sea and sky. The closer they came, the more it took on shape, a low, rolling shadow that stretched across the distance. Leaf's breath caught. Without meaning to, he placed a hand again on the dragon's head, as he had in the night, as if seeking balance. Land, someone whispered. The words spread softly along the length of the ship. Men rose from their benches, squinting against the light, craning their necks. Tirkir moved forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied the distant shoreline. "This is no ice," he said after a moment. "No floating bergs, no broken fields of white. This is earth." The ship pressed on. The air began to change as the day dipped lower, carrying scents that were not of the open sea. There was a hint of moss, of soil warmed beneath unseen trees, of something green and quiet. The men fell even more silent, each feeling in his own way the strange intimacy of approaching a land no one among them had ever known. Closer still, and they could see that the coastline was not sheer and forbidding, but gathered into soft rises and dips. Low hills met the water, with darker bands of what could only be forest beyond. The sky above that distant land seemed somehow gentler, its colors washed with a faint, hazy gold. Leif felt a slow, deep calm settle over him. Fear, excitement, wonder, all of it blended into something steady. This was what he had come for, what the ship itself seemed made for, to slip across the unknown and press its prow against a shore that had, until now, existed only in half-remembered stories and scattered rumors. "Bring us in slowly," he said. "We'll look for a bay, a quiet place to land." The men bent to their work with a muted, reverent readiness. The longship angled nearer the shoreline, its sails shifting, oars dipping lightly to guide it. The water shallowed gradually, turning from deep indigo to softer hues, greenish and lit from beneath where the sun's light reached toward the unseen bottom. In the distance, a small cove opened in the coastline, a sheltered curve where the land embraced the sea in a gentle arc. The approach was clear of rocks. The water, calm grasses trailed along the edge, and beyond them, a scatter of low shrubs and the first hints of taller trees, their leaves stirring faintly in the breeze. "That will do," Leif murmured. They glided into the cove as evening colors thickened in the sky. The oars pulled back. The men prepared the anchor stone, letting it slide down with a soft, muffled splash. The longship settled into stillness, the faint rocking of the water, now a reassuring cradle, rather than a ceaseless journey. For a long moment, no one moved. They listened to the soft lap of waves against the hull, to the distant rustle of leaves on unknown trees, to the calls of birds they did not recognize. The land, so close now, seemed to breathe quietly, an immense presence that had been waiting patiently for their arrival. Leaf drew in a slow breath of air that tasted of soil and growth, different from the sharp salt tang he had known for weeks. "We will go ashore," he said gently. "Not in a rush. Step by step. The sea has carried us far. Let us meet this place with respect." They lowered a small boat and drifted toward the narrow strip of shore. The water around them was glassy, reflecting the subtle colors of the sky. As the keel brushed the sand, a quiet shiver passed through the men, as if they were crossing a boundary, not just of distance, but of time itself. Leaf stepped out first. His boots sank slightly into the damp, cool sand. The sensation was strangely profound, as if the earth itself were acknowledging him. He walked a little farther up the beach, until the sand gave way to firmer ground, then stopped and simply stood there. Behind him, the others followed, their footfalls soft. They spread out slowly, touching the low shrubs, bending to feel the texture of unfamiliar plants, lifting their faces to smell the air. No settlement greeted them, no smoke, no voices, only the quiet murmur of the waves and the occasional call of a bird from the forest's edge. "This is it," Bjarni said quietly, his voice almost breath. "We have stepped onto a land that no one in our world truly knows." Leaf nodded. "We will learn its shape," he replied. "We will walk its forests, drink from its streams, and see what stories it holds. And we will carry those stories back, so others may know that the world is wider than they imagined." They moved inland a short distance, careful, unhurried. The ground rose gently, dotted with stones and small patches of grass. The trees beyond were tall and unfamiliar, their leaves shimmering softly in the breeze. Shadows deepened among their trunks as the light faded, but it was not an unfriendly darkness. It felt alive, watchful, without being hostile. As they explored the edge of the woods, Tyrkir knelt beside a low vine that trailed across a small rise. Dark clusters of berries hung from it, heavy and ripe. He studied them intently, his face lit with an old, deep memory of other lands, other harvests. "Leif," he called softly. "Come see." Leif joined him, crouching beside the vine. Tyrkir plucked a berry, rolling it between his fingers. "I have seen the like before," he murmured, "back in the southern lands, beyond our northern seas. Grapes or something very like them. Grapes!" The word hung in the air like a promise. "This is a good place," Leif said at last. "A gentle place. Perhaps it will be our Vinland, a land of wine and growth." They did not shout or cheer. The moment was too large for that. Instead, they shared a quiet, steady look, the kind that passes between people who realize they're standing at the opening of a door that will never close again. They returned to the ship at dusk, the sky now brushed with long strokes of purple and deep blue. Stars kindled once more, scattered across the firmament. The men settled in, their voices soft, their movements slowed by a deep, peaceful fatigue that came not just from travel, but from the weight of what they had found. Leif lay awake for a time, listening to the mingled sounds of land and sea. The waves lapped gently against the hull. Somewhere in the nearby forest, a night creature called, an unfamiliar voice in the darkness, neither threatening nor inviting, simply present. He felt the world expanding around him, like the sea had once expanded in his imagination when he first heard tales of distant shores. Now, those shores were under his feet. The map in his mind was no longer bounded by the edges of old stories. It pushed outward, making room for this new coastline, these new trees, these new stars overhead. As sleep finally drew him under, it seemed to him that the dragon-headed ship, resting quietly in the cove, was no longer perched at the edge of the world. Instead, it lay anchored in the middle of a much larger, deeper mystery, one that would carry ripples far into the future, long after their names were forgotten. The night passed, and with the dawn, the work of understanding the land began. They spent the next days exploring the coast, moving carefully along the shoreline, landing where small rivers met the sea, where sheltered inlets offered calm waters, where the forest opened into gentle meadows. They moved like guests who did not yet know the language of their host, watching, listening, learning the quiet patterns of wind and grass and water. They found streams cold and clear, their beds lined with smooth stones. They found stands of tall trees, some dark and needled, others broad-leafed and shifting with every breath of wind. They saw birds whose calls were strange to their ears, and animals slipping through the underbrush, quick shadows in the greenery. At each landing, they left the place as undisturbed as they could, taking only what they needed, marking little. They built small fires, careful with the embers, letting the smoke drift upward in faint grey tendrils. As they sat around those fires at night, the faces of the men flickered in the glow, their eyes reflecting both the light of the flames and the unspoken wonder of being so far from home in a land that had never known their kind. Sometimes, as the embers settled and the conversation faded, someone would speak up softly, telling of other voyages, of Iceland's cold shores, of Greenland's hard edges, of storms weathered and ice fields skirted. Those stories, once the farthest reach of their imagination, now felt like steps along a path that had led here. Leif listened to them all with quiet attention. The more they walked this new coastline, the more he felt that they were not just adding to their own saga, but stitching this land into the larger fabric of the world. They knew it had waited, silent and patient, while their people had sailed and settled the north. Now, at last, the threads had crossed. On one of those evenings, as the fire burned low and the stars shimmered overhead in a calm, untroubled sky, Leif lifted his gaze and let it wander across the constellations he had followed since childhood, the familiar shapes that guided sailors across the vastness. "They have always been there," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "The stars, the lands, the currents, we have only just learned to see the paths between them." Tyrkir, seated nearby, nodded slowly. "And others may walk those paths after us," he replied. "In time, this land will not be a whisper, but a place with a name spoken in many halls." Leif thought of that, of ships like theirs, of families, of settlements, of fires lit along this distant shore, voices rising in languages that had never touched this air before. The idea felt both distant and very close, like a shadow cast by a fire yet to be lit. For now, though, the land remained mostly untouched, their presence a small ripple in a vast, quiet sea of time. They would not stay long. Their purpose was to see, to know, to remember, and then to return. Yet even as they made their preparations, gathering small sample of wood and grapes and other signs of the richness they had found, a soft certainty settled in Leif's heart. This was not the end of the story. This was only the first line, spoken into the hush of a sleeping world. He felt it in the way the wind curled around the sail, in the way the waves welcomed the keel, in the way the forest watched them with a patience that suggested it expected more visitors in ages to come. When at last they turned the prow of the ship away from the shore and let the wind catch the sail for the journey back toward Greenland, Leif did not feel that they were leaving the land behind. Instead, it felt as though the memory of it had already traveled ahead of them, carried in the shape of the waves, in the flight of birds, in the changing light on the water. The longship moved smoothly across the sea, and the coastline slowly diminished, a dark line, then a smudge, then only an idea. But in the minds of those aboard, it remained vivid. The taste of the air, the softness of the sand beneath their boots, the rustle of leaves and trees that had never known the sound of their speech before. As night fell and the stars reappeared, steady and unchanging, Leif lay awake once more beneath the sky. The same constellations that had accompanied them west now stretched overhead, guiding them eastward toward home. Yet home itself had shifted, its boundaries stretched by what they had seen. He closed his eyes and saw again the curve of that sheltered cove, the ripples along its surface, the way the forest waded just beyond the line of shore. The voyages, he realized, were not just paths cut through the sea. They were threads binding places together, making the world feel at once larger and more connected. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, he felt himself drifting gently towards sleep as the ship rocked and the waves whispered their long, slow lullaby. Years later, long after the first journey, when the memory of that gentle coastline settled into the hearts of many, other ships would follow. The ocean did not change its nature for them. It remained the same vast, restless being, breathing wind and wave, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce. Yet the men who set out upon it were different. They carried with them the knowledge that the sea did not simply fall away into nothingness beyond Greenland. They knew there was land in that wide westward silence, land with forests and flowing waters, land where grapes and game and timber might be found. And so the voyages continued. One ship, smaller than Leif's, but sturdy and well made, set out from Greenland under a sky streaked with pale clouds. Among its crew were men and women who had heard the stories of Vinland as children, their imaginations shaped by the tales of their elders. Now, they wanted to see for themselves what lay beyond the horizon. The leader of this voyage, Karlsefni, stood at the helm with a quiet determination. He had listened to Leif's accounts by the longhouse fire, had seen the wood and grapes and other tokens brought back from that distant shore. To him, Finland was not just a curiosity, it was a possibility, a place where families might settle, where farms might take root, where winter might be kinder than in the cold, hard lands of the north. As the ship rocked gently on the swells, his gaze travelled over the faces of those aboard. There were strong-armed sailors, used to hauling nets and rowing through sleet. There were women cradling children, their eyes bright with both worry and hope. There were older men, grey in hair, but still sharp of mind, who had seen many coasts and now wished to see one more. Crossing was not simple. There were days when fog wrapped itself around the ship so tightly that the world shrank to the sound of water against the hull and the feel of damp air on their skin. There were nights when the wind rose and the waves lifted them high, then dropped them deep into cold hollows, the ship's timbers groaning softly with the strain. Yet they held to their course, guided by the stars and currents, and by the quiet belief that beyond the arc of the sea, that remembered shore still waited. When, at last, the birds appeared and the scent of unseen earth drifted over the water, a murmur passed along the ship. People straightened, eyes turned eagerly toward the horizon. As before, the first sight of land came like a slow revelation, a dark line, a soft shape, a coastline emerging from haze. Karlsefni stood silent as they approached, his heart beating in slow, heavy thuds. For him, this was more than the fulfillment of a story. It was the opening of a new chapter in the lives of those who had left behind their homes for the unknown. They found, not far from where Leif's ship had once anchored, a place that seemed well suited to their hopes. A gentle river flowed into the sea, its mouth widening into a sheltered bay. Meadows spread along its banks, and beyond them, forested hills rose in quiet layers. They landed cautiously, as Leif's crew had done years before, stepping onto the sand with a mixture of reverence and careful curiosity. But this time, there was more activity, more movement. They unloaded goods, tools, livestock. They walked the ground not just as visitors, but as people looking for the best places to build shelters, to plant crops, to tether animals. The land received them with the same quiet patience it had shown the first explorers. The river ran on, untroubled, its surface reflecting the sky. Birds flitted through the trees, indifferent to the newcomers. Wind moved in the grass with a sound like the soft breathing of a sleeping world. They built their first dwellings near the river's edge, simple structures of timber and turf, low but sturdy, their roofs blending into the land itself. Smoke soon began to curl upward from their hearts, thin grey lines against the sky. Children's voices, unsure at first, then more confident, mixed with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. At night, the people of this small settlement gathered around their fires, the glow casting gentle halos around their faces. They spoke of home, of Greenland's harsh winters, of Iceland's volcanic shores, of the old stories from Norway and beyond. Yet more and more, their words turned to this place, the feel of the soil beneath their hands, the taste of its water, the paths through its forests. They gave names to the river, to the bay, to the nearby hills, stitching their own language into the fabric of the land. Those names, carried on the wind and spoken over meals, formed the place with a quiet familiarity. Yet they knew they were not alone in this wide world. In time, they saw signs that others lived here too. Not their kind, but people whose presence was written in the remains of fires, in tracks along the riverbank, in tools left near berry bushes. The first encounters were distant, a glimpse of figures in the trees, a canoe moving quietly along the far shore of the river, the echo of voices carried by the wind. Karlsefni, standing at the edge of the forest one morning, saw 3 figures watching from across a meadow. They were still as stones, yet he could feel their alertness even at a distance. He lifted his hand. palm open, a gesture as old as greeting itself. For a moment, nothing happened. Then one of the figures lifted a hand as well, mirroring his motion. The moment passed like a breath. The figures melted back into the trees, gone as silently as they had appeared. Life in the settlement unfolded in rhythms shaped by the land. They fished in the river, the lines dipping into water that ran quiet and deep. They hunted game in the forest, moving with care, learning where the deer passed, where the wild animals drank at dusk. They gathered berries and other plants, guided sometimes by what they already knew, sometimes by cautious experimentation. Season followed season. The days grew longer, then shorter, then longer again. The settlers began to sense how the year turned in this new place, how the light shifted and the winds changed. Winter came, but it was softer than the winters of Greenland. Snow fell, but it did not seem as heavy. The river froze along its edges, but not entirely. The forest, even in its bareness, felt alive. Yet with all the gentleness of the land, there were difficulties. Crops did not always grow as expected. The unfamiliar plants sometimes concealed dangers. Hunting could be uncertain. And beneath everything lay an undercurrent of unease, a sense that the invisible lines between their world and that of the Maple who already lived here were delicate. Sometimes at night, Karlsefni lay awake, listening to the sounds beyond the walls of his hall, the crackle of the fire, the shifting of sleepers, the distant hoot of an owl. He thought of how far they were from the familiar coasts of home, how thin the line of their presence was here. It felt like a small flame burning in a vast darkness, beautiful, hopeful, but fragile. He did not speak of this often. Instead, he rose each morning and joined in the work, repairing structures, planning hunting trips, walking the paths near the settlement's edge, watching the tree line where the forest began. Over time, the encounters with the native people of the land grew more frequent. There were moments of quiet exchange, a shared fish, a traded tool, a hesitant smile. There were moments of tension, when a movement was misunderstood or a boundary crossed unknowingly. People of the settlement began to understand that they were not simply writing their own story here. They had entered into a story already in progress, one with its own deep roots and countless voices. One evening, as the sky dimmed and the river's surface turned to silver, Karlsefni stood with a small group near the edge of the settlement. A canoe approached along the river, paddled by two figures. They came slowly, without haste, their motions smooth and calm. When they drew near the shore, they paused, measuring the distance, measuring the faces watching them. Karlsefni stepped forward, leaving his weapons behind. He held out a small object, a piece of cloth dyed with a bright, rich color. The canoe's nearer paddler studied it for a moment, then reached into a woven bag and brought out a carved object, a small figure of wood shaped with care. They traded, hands crossing briefly over the water between canoe and shore. No words were shared that either side could understand. Yet in that exchange, something quiet passed between them, a recognition that, for all the distance and difference, they shared the same sky, the same river, the same night that would soon settle over the land. The voyages of the Vikings to this new world were not only journeys of distance, they were journeys of understanding, incomplete and fragile as all first meetings are. Those who came built their homes, but also carried with them the weight of their own history, their own ways of seeing the world. The land, already rich with the stories of those who had lived here for generations beyond counting, received them, but did not yield its entirety. In time, many of the settlers would leave. Some would find the uncertainties too great, tensions too wearing. Others would simply long for the familiar contours of their old homes. The sea, which had carried them here, would carry them back again. Their houses would stand for a while, then slowly dissolve into the earth, wood rotting, turf blending back into soil. Grass would grow where walls once stood. Trees would reclaim open spaces. The river would continue its slow journey to the sea, indifferent to the brief presence of those who had paused along its banks. Yet the memory of these voyages would persist. In Greenland, in Iceland, in the far halls of Norway, tales would be told of Finland, the gentle land to the west where grapes grew and winters were kind. For some, the tales would be almost dreamlike, blurred at the edges, more myth than record. For others, they would be as real as the feel of salt spray on one's face. Parents would tell their children about the time their kin had crossed a vast unknown and touched a shore no one had known before. Around fires, in the dark of winter, voices would speak of forests that seemed endless, of rivers that carried sunlight along their surfaces, of birds whose cries were unlike any heard in the north. They would speak of canoes on quiet waters, of wary greetings, of the realization that the world was filled with many peoples, each with their own ways, their own understanding of the land. Generations would pass, the voyages would slip into the long river of memory, mingling with other tales of far journeys and harsh seas. Some would forget the exact details, names would fade, dates would blur, but the core of the story would remain, that once, long before many would believe or fully understand it, ships from the far north had sailed across the western sea and touched another continent. Far to the west, where the river flowed into the sea and the forest watched the shore, the land remembered in its own way. The old paths through the trees remained, traced by animals and people alike. The places where fires had once burned held a different quality to the soil, a subtle richness. A stone that had once been shaped by hands far from this place might lie half buried in the earth, moss creeping slowly over it, its meaning lost, yet its presence undeniable. Birds flew overhead, following their own inherited routes. Seasons turned. Children born in the villages of the land grew up with their own stories, some of which included mention of strangers in longboats, of brief visits, of small exchanges. For them, these were not tales of discovery, but of encounters, moments when different worlds brushed lightly against each other before moving apart again. The sea, indifferent to questions of who came first or who discovered whom, continued to rise and fall, its waves erasing and redrawing the shoreline in small, ceaseless ways. It remembered each ship that had crossed its surface only as a disturbance in its pattern, a momentary reordering of foam and current. Yet, in some sense, each voyage left an imprint, not in the water itself, but in the minds and hearts of those who sailed, and in the stories they carried home. Centuries later, when other ships from other lands would make similar crossings, guided by different maps and driven by different desires, the ocean would greet them with the same impartial motion, the land would receive them with the same quiet patience. New names would be given, new flags planted, new claims spoken. But beneath all of that, the older truth would remain. The world had always been wide, always filled with countless lives and stories, long before anyone people set sail to measure it with their own eyes. The voyages of the Vikings to the New World were a part of that truth, a series of journeys that, like soft waves, rolled gently from one shore to another, leaving behind traces that would sometimes be forgotten, sometimes rediscovered. Their longships, with their dragon heads and curved hulls, were instruments of curiosity as much as of bravery, carrying not just warriors, but farmers, traders, families, dreams. In the quiet of a long northern night, when the wind howled outside and snow pressed against the walls, it was easy to imagine those longships again, to see them drifting under a sky sprayed with stars, their sails catching the pale light of the moon. To picture men wrapped in cloaks against the chill, staring into the darkness ahead, and wondering what shape the morning would bring to the edge of the sea. A storyteller, seated by the hearth, might pause and let the silence stretch. The listeners, leaning closer, would feel the hush deepen, as if the room itself were waiting. Then, in a soft, steady voice, the storyteller would speak of Leif and his men, stealing through the night toward a coastline they had only half believed in, of the first step onto that damp, cool sand, of the grapes on the vine, heavy and ripe beneath an unfamiliar sky, of Karlsefni's settlement beside the river, of the smoke rising in thin spirals, of the quiet exchanges along the water's edge. The words would flow like the sea, calm and unhurried, carrying the listeners in their minds across the centuries and over the waves, until they could almost feel the rocking of the longship beneath them, hear the creak of the timbers, smell the mingled scents of salt and pine and distant earth. Outside, the wind would go on blowing and the snow would keep falling, but inside, by the fire, the world would gently widen, the edges of the map softening and flowing outward to make space for that distant shore. In that moment, the voyages would not be something lost in the past. They would be happening again, here, in the quiet space between words and breath. The longships would be gliding once more toward a waiting coastline. The stars would be shining above them, as they always had, as they always would. And as the story settled into its final, soft cadence, as the listeners' eyes grew heavy and their thoughts began to drift, the sense would remain that the world is vast and filled with hidden coasts, that beyond each known horizon, there may lie a shore waiting peacefully for the moment someone is brave enough, or curious enough, to seek it. The fire would sink into embers. The room would dim. Sleep would fold itself gently around the listeners, as the memory of waves and distant forests and starlit sails lingered lightly in their minds. Somewhere in that hazy space between waking and dreams, they would feel themselves carried across a wide, calm sea, toward a distant line of land where the river meets the ocean and the trees whisper softly in a language older than any map. And there, upon that quiet shore, the voyages of the Vikings to the New World would go on, not as battles or conquests, but as a slow, enduring echo, a reminder that the world has always been broader, more mysterious, and more beautifully connected than any single story can fully contain. The vanishing of Roanoke Colony. The salt wind cut across the sound with a sharpness that made Eleanor Dare pull her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She stood at the edge of the settlement, watching the grey waters stretch endlessly toward England, toward home, toward a rescue that had not come. behind her, the crude houses of Roanoke sat like broken teeth against the tree line, their timber walls already weathering to the color of old bone in the relentless coastal air. It had been nearly 3 years since John White had sailed away, promising to return with supplies within months. 3 years of dwindling hope, of watching the horizon for sails that never appeared, of stretching provisions thinner and thinner until the very act of survival had become their only occupation. Eleanor's daughter Virginia toddled beside her, now a sturdy child of 3, born into this strange new world with no memory of the old one. The girl bent to examine a shell, her small fingers tracing its spiraled ridges with the solemnity of a scholar. Eleanor felt her heart constrict. What future awaited this child? What had they condemned her to by bringing her here? By steeing when every rational impulse screamed for them to find some way, any way, back across that merciless ocean. Ellie. The voice belonged to Ananias, her husband, emerging from the palisade gate. His face had grown leaner over the months, carved down to essential angles by hunger and worry. Manteo's returned. He says we need to gather everyone. There's news. Eleanor scooped Virginia into her arms and followed Ananias back through the gate. The settlement proper was a sorry sight. 12 houses arranged around a central square, a church that had never been properly finished, and the fort itself, whose walls seemed to grow more fragile with each passing storm. The colonists were gathering near the well, their faces etched with that peculiar expression she'd come to recognize. Hope and dread in equal measure, the two emotions so intertwined they'd become indistinguishable. Manteo stood in the center of the crowd, his bearing as dignified as ever despite the obvious exhaustion in his eyes. He was Croatoan, one of the few natives who had remained friendly to the English settlement, and over the years he had become more than just their interpreter. He was their lifeline, their only connection to understanding this land they'd so presumptuously claimed. "The Sekatan are moving," Manteo said without preamble. His English had become flawless over his time with him, though he retained a cadence that made each word sound like it carried more weight than an Englishman's speech. "Not just one village, all of them. They're going inland, away from the coast." "Why?" Governor White's assistant, a man named Harvey, stepped forward. He'd assumed unofficial leadership in White's absence, though no one had explicitly granted him the authority. "Have they said anything about us?" Manteo's expression was grave. "They don't speak of you at all. That's what troubles me. Among my people, there are stories. When the great sickness came, before you English knew this land existed, it moved like wind through dry grass. Village after village fell silent. The Sekatan, remember. They're moving because they fear it's coming again." A murmur rippled through the colonists. Disease was the invisible enemy, more frightening than any warrior's arrow. They'd been fortunate so far. Aside from the usual flux and fever, nothing catastrophic had struck the settlement. But fortune, Eleanor knew, was a fickle companion. "There's more," Manteo continued. "The Wepemiok to the north have stopped trading. The Chawanok will not even let messengers approach their villages. Something is wrong in this land, and you English sit here at the edge of it, waiting for a rescue that—" He stopped himself, but the unspoken words hung in the air like smoke. A rescue that will never come. That night, Eleanor lay beside Ananias in their narrow bed, listening to Virginia's soft breathing from the corner where her daughter slept on a pallet, stuffed with cattail down. The darkness was complete, the kind of darkness England had forgotten, unbroken by street lamps or watchfires beyond the palisade's edge. "We should have left with the others," Ananias whispered. He meant the smaller group that had departed months ago, determined to sail north to the Chesapeake Bay, where the land was rumoured to be more hospitable. No one knew if they'd made it. "We didn't have a choice," Eleanor replied, though the words felt hollow. There had been a choice, technically, but with Virginia still nursing, with the boat barely seaworthy, with the risks multiplying with every mile from the only shelter they knew, the choice had been an illusion. "Manteo's right. Your father isn't coming back." Eleanor had suspected as much for months, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that thought never could. John White, her father, the governor who'd left them here, either dead in England or trapped by circumstance, or perhaps he'd simply moved on, found excuses not to return to this failed colony at the edge of the world. "Then we need to decide what we're going to do," she said. "All of us, together." The meeting was held 3 days later in the unfinished church. All 112 remaining colonists crowded into the space, their faces illuminated by tallow candles that gave off more smoke than light. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Harvey stood at the makeshift altar, trying to project authority he didn't quite possess. "We have 3 options as I see it. First, we stay here and continue waiting for relief from England. Second, we attempt to build vessels and sail to the Chesapeake, following the others. Third," he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next, "we abandon the settlement entirely and seek to join with one of the native tribes." The last suggestion provoked immediate uproar. "Leave us savages?" someone shouted. "We're Christian Englishmen." "We're starving Christian Englishmen," replied Thomas Stevens, one of the assistants, "and our children are starving. I'd rather live as a savage, as you put it, than die as a proud corpse." Arguments erupted across the church. Eleanor held Virginia close, covering the child's ears against the rising voices. She caught Manteo's eye across the room. He stood against the wall, observing with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not judgment, exactly. Perhaps pity. It was Dinas Harvey who finally restored order, slamming his hand against the altar with such force that the candles jumped. "Enough. We'll put it to a vote. But understand this. Whatever we choose together. This colony survives as one or dies as one." The debate stretched late into the night. The younger colonists, those without families, largely favoured the Chesapeake option. Movement seemed better than slow decay. The older ones, exhausted by the years of hardship, were divided between staying and seeking native protection. The families with children were the most fearful, paralysed by the knowledge that any choice might doom their offspring. Finally, as the candles burned to stubs, a compromise emerged. They would prepare to leave Roanoke, but not yet. First, they would send scouts to make contact with the Croatoan, Manteo's people, to determine if the tribe would accept them. Simultaneously, they would begin gathering materials to carve messages indicating where they'd gone in case rescue did eventually arrive. And they would wait until spring, giving them time to prepare properly and giving Governor White one last season to fulfill his promise. Eleanor voted with the majority, though her heart wasn't in it. Delay and compromise, the English way. She wondered what the Croatoan would think of a people who couldn't decide their own fate, even as it slipped away. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with unusual ferocity. The sound froze in places, something Manteo said he'd never seen before. Cold crept through every gap in the timber walls, and the colonists burned through their firewood at an alarming rate. Hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not, the deer having moved to better forage elsewhere. It was during one of these hunting expeditions that William Withers disappeared. He'd gone out with 3 other men, tracking a deer trail through the woods. When the others returned at dusk, Withers wasn't with them. "We spread out," explained John Gibbs, his face pale, "to cover more ground. When we called for him to regroup, there was no answer. We searched until the light failed, but—" He trailed off helplessly. Search parties went out the next morning. They found Withers' musket propped against a tree, his powder horn beside it, carefully placed as if he'd set them down intentionally. But of the man himself, there was no trace. No signs of struggle, no blood, no footprints leading away through the snow. It was as if he'd simply evaporated. The disappearance cast a pall over the settlement darker than any winter storm. People began to remember other strange occurrences, tools that went missing and reappeared in different locations, sounds in the forest that didn't match any known animal. The sensation of being watched when working outside the palisade, things that had seemed like imagination or coincidence, now took on sinister significance. "My people have stories," Manteo said when Eleanor asked him about it. They were alone in the storehouse, taking inventory of the dwindling grain supplies. About the forest swallowing people, not killing them, swallowing them, taking them into itself. But these are old stories from before my grandfather's time. "Do you believe them?" Manteo was quiet for a long moment, measuring out another pound of cornmeal. "I believe that this land is older than your people understand. You see a forest and think it's just trees. You see the sound and think it's just water. But everything here has presence, awareness. Does that sound like madness to you?" "A month ago, I would have said yes," Eleanor admitted. "Now I'm not sure what I believe anymore." Winter deepened. 3 more colonists died, 2 from fever, 1 from an injury that festered despite all attempts at treatment. They buried them outside the palisade, the frozen ground requiring hours of labor to dig each grave. Eleanor noticed that they'd stopped marking the graves with crosses. It seemed pointless somehow, as if the symbols of their faith had lost meaning in this place. Virginia grew thinner despite Eleanor's best efforts. The child didn't complain. She was too young to remember anything different. But Eleanor could see her daughter's ribs pressing against her skin, could feel the delicate fragility of her bones when she picked her up. At night, Eleanor would lie awake, calculating how many more weeks they could survive on current rations, trying to decide which future was worse. Slow starvation here, or the risks of moving on. Spring came reluctantly, the ice breaking up with sounds like distant cannon fire. The colonists emerged from their houses pale and weak, blinking in the stronger light like creatures dragged from underground. Of the 112 who'd survived to winter, they'd lost 9 more. 103 souls remained, waiting to learn their fate. Manteo returned from Croatoan Island in early April with cautious news. His people would accept them, but not as colonists maintaining a separate community. If the English came, they would come as supplicants, willing to adopt Croatoan ways, to intermarry, to become part of the tribe rather than remain apart. There would be no maintaining of English identity, no clinging to their former lives. "It's assimilation," Harvey said flatly, when Monteo delivered the message to the gathered colonists. "Cultural extinction." "It's survival," countered Eleanor. She stood with Virginia on her hip, the child's weight almost nothing now. "We can preserve our stories, our knowledge, even if we change how we live." "Isn't that better than preserving nothing but our pride?" The argument that followed was the fiercest yet. Families split on the issue. Friends who'd crossed an ocean together found themselves on opposite sides. The younger generation, especially those born here or who'd arrived as children, were more willing to adapt. The older colonists saw it as a betrayal of everything they'd sacrificed to establish. In the end, no consensus emerged. Instead, the colony fractured along the very fault lines they'd tried so hard to avoid. Roughly half, led by Harvey and several of their original assistants, decided they would make for the Chesapeake after all, trusting in their English resourcefulness and God's providence. The other half, including Eleanor, Ananias, and Virginia, would go with Monteo to Croatoan. A smaller third group, perhaps a dozen individuals, announced they would stay at Roanoke, maintaining the settlement for when rescue inevitably arrived. Eleanor looked at their faces. True believers, everyone, unable to accept that England had forgotten them. She wanted to argue, to force them to see reason, but what right did she have? Her own choice might be just as fatal. They had 2 weeks to prepare before the departure. In that time, the colonists transformed from a single reluctant community into 3 separate groups, each convinced of their own path's righteousness and skeptical of the other's chances. The carving of the messages became a solemn ritual. They had decided to leave markers indicating where each group had gone, carved into the palisade posts and the trees nearby. For those going to Croatoan, the word was simple: Croatoan, cut deep into the wood. For the Chesapeake group, they carved directional markers and the letters CRO, intending to complete more detailed messages along their route. The staying group insisted on carving nothing, as if any message would be an admission of defeat. Eleanor watched as Ananias worked on one of the palisade posts, his knife moving with careful precision. Croatoan, 7 letters that represented the end of everything they'd tried to build here, and the beginning of something they couldn't quite envision. Virginia sat nearby, arranging stones in patterns only she understood, humming a tune that might have been English, or might have been something she'd heard from the Croatoan children who sometimes visited. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Ananias asked without looking up from his work. Eleanor had stopped counting how many times they'd asked each other this question. "I think we're doing a thing," she said. "Whether it's right or wrong won't be clear until it's too late to change it." The night before the departures, the 3 groups held a final meal together. It was a meager affair, thin stew and hard bread, but they'd pooled their resources for this one last gesture of unity. Someone produced a fiddle and played old English tunes that made Eleanor's throat tight with longing for a country she'd left behind so many years ago. It felt like another lifetime. John Bridger, one of those staying behind, stood to speak. He was an older man, weathered by a hard life even before coming to Roanoke. "I bear no ill will to those departing," he said. his voice carrying across the hushed gathering. "I understand your reasons, but I made a promise to Governor White, to the Queen, to myself, that I would hold this ground for England. Some promises can't be broken just because they become inconvenient." There was scattered applause, though Eleanor noticed it came mostly from his own group. The rest simply nodded respectfully, too tired for argument, too focused on their own anxieties about the morning. Anteo spoke next, his words measured and careful. "My people have a saying. The river doesn't care which direction you face when you drown. This land will be here long after all our decisions are forgotten. What matters is how we treat each other in the time we have. You English have strange ways, but you've also shown honor and friendship. Whatever comes next, that won't be forgotten." The meal dissolved into smaller conversations, people saying their farewells to friends they might never see again. Children who'd played together every day of their lives cried and clung to each other, not understanding why they had to separate. Parents made promises to meet again that everyone knew were lies told from kindness rather than conviction. Eleanor found herself face to face with Margaret Lawrence, who'd been her closest friend since the voyage over. Margaret's family had chosen the Chesapeake route, believing the rumours of better land and the possibility of encountering other English settlements to the north. "Tell me we'll see each other again," Margaret said, gripping Eleanor's hands with surprising strength. Eleanor wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but found she couldn't. "Tell me you'll survive," she said instead. "Tell me your children will grow old and have children of their own, and that someday, somehow, our grandchildren might meet and share the story of us." They held each other for a long moment, two women who'd crossed an ocean together, born children in a wilderness, and watched dreams crumble like sand. When they separated, both were crying, but neither apologized for it. Departures began at first light. The Chesapeake group left first, 47 people loading their possessions onto rough carts and hoisting packs onto their backs. They'd managed to construct 2 small boats from salvaged timber, barely seaworthy but sufficient for coastal travel. Their plan was to move north along the barrier islands, then inland when they found the right passage. Eleanor stood with the others watching them go, trying to memorize faces that were already beginning to fade into the morning mist. Harvey led the column, his back straight with determination or stubborn pride. It was hard to tell which. The children looked back over their shoulders, waving until their parents urged them forward. By noon, the Chesapeake group had vanished into the forest, and it was time for the Croatoan party to depart. 43 colonists remained with Manteo, including Eleanor's family. They travelled lighter than the others, having been advised by Manteo to leave behind most of their English possessions. "You can't live between 2 worlds," he'd told them. "The weight will drown you." Still, Eleanor had secreted away a few treasures. Her mother's ring, a small Bible, a lock of hair from Virginia's first cutting. Things to remember who they'd been, even as they became someone new. The journey to Croatoan Island took 3 days. They moved south along the barrier islands, through maritime forests of twisted live oaks, and across tidal marshes that sucked at their boots. Manteo led them confidently, knowing every trail and shortcut, pointing out edible plants and warning them away from dangerous animals. On the second night, they camped on a beach with the Atlantic rolling endlessly before them. Virginia fell asleep in Eleanor's arms almost immediately, exhausted by the day's travel. Eleanor sat with Ananias, watching the waves catch the moonlight. I keep thinking about the ones who stayed, Ananias said. 13 people in that empty settlement, waiting for a rescue that's never coming. What will they do when winter comes again? Eleanor had been trying not to think about it. The image haunted her, Bridger and the others growing thinner and more desperate, watching the horizon with fading hope, until one by one they succumbed to hunger or disease or simple despair. She wondered if they'd maintain the settlement to the end, or if eventually they'd abandon it too, scattering into the forest to die alone. Maybe rescue will come, she said, but the words were ash in her mouth. They reached Croatoan Island on the afternoon of the 3rd day, crossing the sound in canoes provided by Monteo's people. The Croatoan village was larger than Eleanor had expected. Perhaps 60 structures arranged around a central plaza with cultivated fields spreading inland. Children ran along the shore to greet them, shouting in their own language, while adults emerged from houses to observe the new arrivals with cautious curiosity. Monteo's mother, a woman named Akayan, stepped forward to welcome them. She was perhaps 60 years old, her face mapped with lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. She spoke in Croatoan, with Monteo translating, though Eleanor suspected the old woman understood more English than she let on. "You come to us with empty hands and full hearts," Akayan said through her son. "This is good. Those who come grasping cannot receive. We will teach you our ways, and perhaps you will teach us some of yours, and together we will see what grows from this planting." The integration was not easy. The colonists were assigned to different families within the tribe, dispersed throughout the village rather than kept together. Eleanor's family was placed with Monteo's extended household, which included his mother, 2 sisters, their husbands, and a small constellation of children whose exact relationships to each other Eleanor couldn't quite follow. The first challenge was language. Virginia, with the plasticity of childhood, picked up Croatoan words almost immediately, chattering with the other children in an increasingly hybrid tongue. Eleanor and Ananias struggled more, their adult minds resistant to new patterns. Monteo was patient, but he made it clear that learning Croatoan wasn't optional. "You can't belong to a people whose words you don't speak," he told them. The second challenge was work. The English concept of labour was different from the Croatoan way. The colonists were used to divisions between men's work and women's work, with strict hierarchies and expectations. The Croatoan had their own divisions, but they were more fluid, and the work itself was constant, attuned to the seasons and the land in ways the English had never managed. Eleanor learned to cultivate the 3 sisters, corn, beans, and squash, planted together in a symbiotic arrangement. She learned to weave baskets from river cane and identify dozens of plants by their uses: food, medicine, tool making, spiritual practice. Her hands, already calloused from years at Roanoke, developed new toughnesses, new capabilities. Ananias learned to fish with weirs and traps, to hunt with bow rather than musket when powder grew too precious to waste. He learned to read the weather in ways that made English predictions seem like children's guessing games. He learned patience. The native hunters could sit motionless for hours, becoming part of the landscape, while Ananias fidgeted and scared away game. Virginia simply learned to be a child of 2 worlds, or perhaps of no particular world at all. She played with the Croatoan children, invented hybrid games that combined English and native elements, and seemed utterly untroubled by the transformation overtaking her family. Sometimes Eleanor would watch her daughter and realize she could no longer distinguish what was English about the child and what was something new entirely. Months passed. Summer came with its oppressive heat and violent thunderstorms. The colonists worked alongside their Croatoan hosts, attending festivals they didn't fully understand, participating in rituals that made some of them uncomfortable, but which they endured out of gratitude and necessity. Some adapted well, others struggled with every aspect of their new lives. Thomas Archard, one of the younger colonists, married a Croatoan woman named Liara in a ceremony that blended English and native customs. It was a strange affair. Eleanor couldn't help but think of it that way, with Christian prayers mixing with Croatoan songs, English vows spoken alongside promises Eleanor only partially understood. But when she looked at the couple's faces, she saw genuine affection, perhaps even love, and something in her heart eased slightly. Others were less successful. Robert Wilkinson, an older colonist who'd been a landowner in England, never reconciled himself to his reduced status. He complained constantly about the lack of privacy, the savage customs, the degradation of English people living like natives. In September, he simply disappeared. Search parties found no trace of him, and the general assumption was that he'd tried to return to Roanoke and gotten lost in the marshes. No one spoke of him after that. Eleanor noticed she thought less and less about the life she'd left behind. The daily demands of survival pushed aside nostalgia for England, for civilization, for all the things she'd once considered essential. She still missed her father, though the missing had transformed into something harder and more bitter. Not grief, but a kind of exhausted resentment at being abandoned. One evening in early autumn, as Eleanor was helping to prepare a feast for the harvest celebration, a Kayan sat beside her. The old woman's English had mysteriously improved over the months, or perhaps she'd simply decided it was time to stop pretending ignorance. "You are sad," Akayan said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor considered denying it, but found she lacked the energy. "I'm mourning," she said. "Mourning the life I thought I would have, the person I thought I was." Akayan nodded slowly. "This is wise. You cannot become new without letting the old self die. But you mourn too long, I think. The dead do not need so much attention. The living need you more." She gestured toward Virginia, who was helping the other children gather firewood, laughing at some joke Eleanor couldn't hear. The child was brown from the sun, wearing a simple shift that was more Croatoan than English, her hair loose rather than properly bound. She looked happy, she looked healthy, she looked nothing like an English girl. "Is she still mine?" Eleanor asked softly. "Or have I lost her too?" Akayan's response was unexpectedly sharp. "She was never yours. Children belong to themselves, to the future. You are only the vessel that brought her here. Now, this land claims her, and you must decide if you will let her go or try to hold her back and damage you both." The words stung, but Eleanor recognized the truth in them. She'd been clinging to Virginia as a reminder of who they used to be, using her daughter as an anchor to a past that no longer existed. It wasn't fair to the child, who had her own life to live in this strange new world. Winter came again, but this time Eleanor's family was prepared. The Croatoan houses were better insulated than the English structures had been, and the tribe's stores were carefully managed to last through lean months. There was hunger. There was always hunger in winter, but not the desperate, gnawing starvation that had characterized their final season at Roanoke. Snow fell on a February morning, unusual for the coast, but not unheard of. Virginia ran outside to play in it, her delighted shouts mixing with those of the Croatoan children. Eleanor watched from the doorway, wrapped in a deerskin cloak that Achayan had given her. Manteo approached, his breath misting in the cold air. "I'm going to Roanoke," he said without preamble, "to see what's become of those who stayed. I thought you might want to come." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. She'd spent months learning not to look back, training herself to accept the present rather than mourn the past. But curiosity and something else, responsibility, perhaps, or guilt, made her nod. "When do we leave?" They set out the next morning with 3 other Croatoan men, traveling in a large canoe across the Sound. The water was grey and choppy, winter cold and hostile. Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the northern shore, watching Roanoke Island emerge from the mist like a ghost of itself. The settlement was visible from the water, or rather, its absence was visible. The palisade stood intact, but something about it looked wrong. As they drew closer, Eleanor realized what she was seeing: emptiness. No smoke rose from the chimneys. No sounds of human activity carried across the water. The place had the peculiar silence of abandonment, of life interrupted and never resumed. They beached the canoe and approached cautiously, though Eleanor couldn't have said what danger they expected. The gate stood open, swinging slightly in the breeze, with a rhythmic creak that was the only sound besides the wind and water. Inside the palisade, the settlement looked almost deliberately arranged. The houses still stood, their doors closed. Tools were stacked neatly beside workshops. The well had been carefully covered. It looked less like a place abandoned in panic, and more like a place whose inhabitants had simply decided to step away for a moment and never returned. "Where are they?" Eleanor whispered, though she didn't know why she was whispering. Manteo shook his head slowly, examining the ground. No signs of struggle, no bodies, no indication of where they went. He moved to one of the palisade posts where Ananias had carved Croatoan months before. The carving was still there, but now someone had scratched additional marks beneath it. Eleanor couldn't tell if they were letters or simple tallies. They searched the entire settlement. In one house, they found a table set for a meal that had never been eaten, the food long since rotted to dust. In another, Eleanor discovered a child's doll sitting on a neatly made bed, as if waiting for someone to return and claim it. The church held a single candle burned down to a puddle of wax on the altar. The storehouse provided the only clear evidence of intentional departure. It had been completely emptied, every last sack of grain and barrel of salt removed. That, at least, suggested planning, conscious choice. But where had they gone, and why had they left no message beyond the original carvings? Outside the settlement, they found the graves they dug the previous winter. Someone had tended them recently. The mounds were neat, marked with crosses that showed no weathering. That meant at least some of the 13 had survived into the new year. But when had they left, and why? As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Manteo declared it was time to leave. "There's nothing more to learn here," he said. "The past has swallowed them, just as it's swallowing this place." Eleanor took one last look at the settlement, Despite everything, despite having left it willingly, she felt a profound sadness at seeing it abandoned. This had been their dream once. A New England, a fresh start, a chance to build something lasting. Now it was just empty buildings slowly decaying, a monument to futile ambition. On the journey back to Croatoan, Eleanor found herself thinking about the different paths her people had taken. The Chesapeake group might have found their better land, or they might have perished in the wilderness. The ones who'd stayed at Roanoke had apparently survived long enough to depart with some planning, but their ultimate fate remained unknown. And her own group, the ones who'd chosen assimilation, well, they were alive, but were they still English? Did that even matter? Years passed, measured not in calendars but in seasons, in plantings and harvests, in storms weathered and children born. Virginia grew into a young woman who could speak Croatoan more fluently than English, who knew the names of plants her mother had never heard of, who moved through the world with a confidence Eleanor had never possessed at that age. She eventually married a man who was himself the child of mixed heritage, his father English from some earlier contact, his mother Hatteras. Their children would be something new entirely, carrying pieces of multiple worlds in their veins. Ananias adapted too, though more slowly. He kept his English name, but took a Croatoan one as well, as did all the colonists who stayed. He learned to find satisfaction in the seasonal rhythms of native life, in the collective nature of tribal existence. Sometimes Eleanor would catch him staring out across the sound toward where Roanoke lay, and she knew he was remembering who they'd been. But those moments grew rarer as time passed. Eleanor herself became someone she wouldn't have recognized at 20. She learned healing from Achayan and other tribal women, became skilled at setting bones and brewing medicines. She taught reading and writing to those Croatoan who wanted to learn, creating a hybrid literacy that used English letters to record native words and stories. She helped negotiate when other English ships occasionally appeared, though these grew less frequent over the years as England's attention turned elsewhere. The other colonists similarly transformed. Some, like Thomas Archard, fully embraced their new identities and became indistinguishable from those born Croatoan. Others maintained more visible English elements, speech patterns, certain customs, small rituals practiced in private. But all of them changed, because change was the price of survival. One spring morning, perhaps 7 or 8 years after they'd left Roanoke, Eleanor was working in the fields when a runner arrived from the north with news. A group of strange people had been spotted in Chesapeake territory. Perhaps a dozen individuals speaking broken English and Algonquian, claiming to be remnants of the Roanoke colony. Eleanor's heart lurched. The Chesapeake group? The ones who'd stayed at Roanoke? Or perhaps someone else entirely? Manteo organized an expedition immediately. Eleanor insisted on joining, despite the journey's difficulty. They traveled north for days, moving through territories that required careful negotiation to pass safely. When they finally reached the Chesapeake village, where the strangers had been taken in, Eleanor barely recognized them as English at all. There were 11 of them, 4 adults and 7 children. They wore native clothing, spoke a jumbled mixture of languages, and carried themselves with the wary exhaustion of people who'd endured more than human beings should have to bear. The leader, a woman named Alice Chapman, who Eleanor vaguely remembered from Roanoke, stared at her visitors with something between hope and fear. "We're from the Croatoan group," Eleanor explained in English, the words feeling strange in her mouth after so long. "We've been living with Manteo's people. Are you from Chesapeake? From Roanoke?" Alice's laugh was bitter. "Both. Neither. We made it to the Chesapeake Bay, found the land just as unforgiving as Roanoke had been. Half our group died the first winter. The survivors split up. Some went further north, searching for Jamestown, though that was foolish, given the settlement hadn't been established yet when we left England." She paused, her expression distant. "I don't know what happened to them. The rest of us ended up here, accepted by these people out of pity, I think." "And the ones who stayed at Roanoke?" Eleanor had to ask. "Did you have any contact with them?" Alice shook her head. "We sent messengers back once, maybe 2 years after we'd left. The settlement was empty. We found the carvings, Croatoan, and assumed everyone had gone to you. You're telling me some stayed." Eleanor explained about the 13 who'd remained, but returning to find the settlement abandoned with no clear indication of where its inhabitants had gone. Alice listened with an expression of profound weariness, as if the mystery was just one more weight added to an already unbearable load. "We're all ghosts," Alice said finally. "All of us who came here. The colony vanished, and we vanished with it. England's forgotten us. Maybe they tell stories about the lost colonists, but they've moved on. We're just footnotes to someone else's history." The words settled over the group like ash. Eleanor wanted to argue, to insist that they mattered, that their struggles and survival meant something, but she couldn't find the words, because Alice was right. They were ghosts. They'd ceased to be English the moment their rescue failed to arrive, but they couldn't quite become fully native either. They existed in the space between, belonging nowhere, completely. That night, the two groups shared a meal and stories. The Chesapeake survivors had their own tales of loss and transformation, of colonists who'd married into tribes, or wandered off into the wilderness, or simply given up and died. They spoke of children who'd forgotten English entirely, of adults who'd changed their names, of the gradual erasure of everything they'd tried to bring to this new world. Eleanor told them about life on Croatoan, about the integration and adaptation, about Virginia's children who would be the first truly American generation. Not English, not simply native, but something synthesized from both. She tried to make it sound hopeful, like a new beginning rather than an ending, but she wasn't sure she succeeded. "Will you come back with us?" Eleanor asked Alice. "Join us on Croatoan? There's room, and Manteo's people are generous." Alice considered it for a long moment before shaking her head. "We've settled here, made promises, formed connections. Moving again." She trailed off, but Eleanor understood. They were too tired for another transformation, another adaptation. Better to stay with the familiar, even if that familiar was itself strange. The expedition returned to Croatoan, carrying the knowledge that some of their former companions had survived, however precariously. It should have felt like a victory, but instead Eleanor felt only a deep melancholy. The colony hadn't just vanished. It had fractured into a dozen pieces, each going its own way, each becoming something unrecognizable. There would be no reunion, no restoration of what had been lost. There was only forward, into an uncertain future that looked nothing like the dreams that had brought them across the ocean. Eleanor lived another 20 years on Croatoan, long enough to see her grandchildren, and even one great-grandchild. She taught them all the English she could, told him stories of a country across the ocean that existed more in memory than reality. But she also learned to let them go, to accept that they would be what this land made them, rather than what she'd tried to preserve. In her final years, she would sometimes walk to the shore and look north toward where Roanoke lay. She'd think about the 13 who'd stayed, about their ultimate fate, about whether they had found whatever they were looking for, or simply wandered into the wilderness and disappeared. She'd think about the Chesapeake group and all its splinters, scattered across the coast like seeds that might or might not take root. She'd think about her own people on Croatoan, who'd survived by surrendering who they'd been. The mystery of the vanished colony would, she knew, outlive her. People would wonder what happened to those lost English settlers, would speculate about their fate, perhaps send expeditions to search for answers. But the truth was simpler and more complicated than any mystery. They hadn't vanished. They'd transformed. They'd made the impossible choices that survival demanded, and in doing so had become something new, something that couldn't be easily categorized or explained. On a warm autumn evening, Eleanor sat with Virginia and watched the sun set over the Sound. The light turned the water molten gold, beautiful and indifferent. Virginia's children played nearby, their laughter a blend of English words and Croatoan phrases, their games hybrid inventions that belonged to no particular tradition. "Do you regret it?" Virginia asked. "Coming here? Staying?" Eleanor thought about the question carefully. Did she regret the loss? Yes. The suffering? Certainly. The transformation that had erased so much of who they'd been? In some deep, irreducible way? Yes. But regret implied she would have chosen differently, and she wasn't sure that was true. "I regret that we had to make the choice at all," she said finally. "But given the choice we faced, I think we did the best we could. We survived. We adapted. We're still here, even if here isn't where we thought we'd be." Virginia nodded, accepting the answer for what it was. Not reassurance or justification, just truth. They sat together in companionable silence as the light faded and the first stars emerged. Two women spanning generations, belonging imperfectly to multiple worlds, carrying forward a story that would never be fully told because its ending was still being written in the lives of children who barely remembered that it had begun on a distant shore with ships and promises and doomed ambitions. The colony of Roanoke vanished, yes, but its people didn't disappear. They dissolved into the landscape, into other cultures, into hybrid identities that confounded the categories their English patrons would have recognized. They became the land's secret, absorbed into its vast indifference, remembered only in carvings on trees and the faint traces of foreign blood running through tribal lines. And perhaps that was the truest form of colonization after all. Not conquest, but surrender. Not triumph, but transformation. Not the changing of the new world, but the changing of those who'd hoped to change it.